World War Now, everybody. I am your host, Conrad Franz, joined as always by Dmitry Kalyagin here with a huge week of World War III analysis. I know we took last week off for Pascha, so Christ is risen. I hope everybody has been enjoying the celebration of the resurrection, their bright week, all of the feasting and everything going on. We're going to be talking a little bit about all of that, some Orthodox news in the Paschal season, the Holy Fire, some of these things, but we of course also need to directly dive into the latest updates about the Russia-Ukraine negotiations, which are, I wouldn't say they're making progress, but there is big news, big new announcements, potential peace deals being discussed and rejected. Of course, the situation in Iran is going the same direction. We have new news about the Oman negotiations between the United States and Iran, new people that are going to be engaging the Iranian side from the U.S. State Department, some very interesting characters. So we're going to be breaking down all of that, as well as the latest from Gaza, from Syria, from Lebanon, everything going on in the Levantine region as Syria apparently wants to recognize Israel, as Israel continues to bombard Gaza, and as the U.S., of course, continues to dramatically strike Yemen as they continue to try to wipe out the Houthis and prevent their Red Sea blockade of Israel. We're obviously also going to talk about the updates from India and Pakistan, two nuclear states supposedly on the brink of war over the situation in Kashmir, where there was a huge terrorist attack recently. And on top of all of that, we're also going to be getting into some of the China trade news, more church persecution news as Ukraine continues to escalate its assaults on the canonical church there. Obviously, in Africa, there are new peace agreements between Congo and Rwanda coming out. But we're going to be discussing all of this and how it factors into the prophecies, World War III, and everything else going on. So it's good to be back after a bit of a hiatus. Like I said, Christ is risen. Dmitry, how are you doing?
Yeah, doing great, Conrad. Christ is risen. It's a good time. It's those 40 really bright days after Easter. I think it goes even beyond the week, just that feeling of happiness and joy leading into Pentecost. And again, the next big feast days thereafter. The Orthodox Church has that rotational calendar, which is very cool. In fact, the feast days repeat themselves and we get to master our faith and our spiritual state. So great things coming. And look, in terms of diplomacy, there are apparently really good things that have been in the works this very interesting fortnight, right? This bi-weekly timeline that we're on right now. For example, Stephen Witkoff, our favorite Jewish diplomat from Donald J. Trump, has revealed the documents which he and Putin will speak about or have spoken about just one day ago on the 25th of April to Reuters, as well as some other major newspapers and media outlets. And this document, essentially for the first time ever, presented an outline of the different territorial disputes and divisions that will take place between Russia and Ukraine if the Russo-American-Ukrainian peace deal goes ahead. Now, what's very curious about this is the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, which me and you, Conrad, discussed months ago, basically all of early 2025. We said this was a major bargaining point for the Russians because despite the fact that the majority of Zaporozhye, I believe, at least the central big cities, are controlled by Ukraine, the most valuable piece of real estate in Zaporozhye, besides the city itself, is the nuclear power plant located in the town of Energodar. Energodar translates essentially to the giver of energy, which is pretty cool, in like a very Soviet-type fashion, located on the coast of the Dnieper River. And, some people were speculating early into the conflict there were about 6 or 7 major dams, essentially. If you remember the Kakhovka Dam explosion south, I guess towards the south end of the Dnieper, which flooded a lot of the Khersonskoye Oblast early on in the conflict years ago now, people were speculating that the Ukrainians were maybe planning a false flag attack to have this Zaporozhye nuclear power plant essentially washed or attacked by like a tsunami, for example, if they blew up some of those dams north, essentially upstream, which would have been disastrous because, this massive tsunami and flooding would again affect the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. But this power plant here provides majority of the energy to Dnipropetrovsk, all the surrounding areas, including areas administered by both the Russians and the Ukrainians at the moment. And this Witkoff plan essentially proposes that the plant will be under U.S. control and administration, with electrical distribution continued to go to both sides. And of course, the Kakhovka Dam itself will be operated and powered by the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. It's very interesting. Trump, it's not just the control over the minerals, which hasn't been signed yet. This deal is still up in the air, but it's also control over energy, which is funny. The entire podcast essentially commenced with the sabotage of the Nord Stream, and we discussed how energy politics will be a major factor in this coming Third World War. And literally, it's being discussed here at the highest, most diplomatic levels. And as we said prior to recording this episode today, Witkoff most likely speaks fluent Russian, as most Ashkenazi Jews do. So it's very interesting. He probably spoke about these exact terms in Russian with Putin personally for, I believe it was 3 hours this meeting went. Some of the other divisions are quite straightforward. In fact, very logical from America's position. They were, the US will de facto recognize Russian control of Lugansk, Crimea, and de facto recognize Russian controls of the other 3 oblasts, which Russia controls only in part, which is Donetsk, Zaporozhye, and Kherson. And again, Ukraine also retakes all of the Kharkovskaya Oblast territories. Notice the Sumskaya Oblast and Kursk are not discussed. That's because, obviously, when we discuss the fighting a little bit later on, this is still very much in flux. But this is a very interesting proposal, almost cutting the Donetsk Oblast completely in half, which Russia is making significant progress in, I would say. In Kupiansk, for example, Pokrovsk, etc., like Chasiv Yar, Ugledar, etc. This is the Bakhmut. This is essentially the front lines of the combat are taking place in Donetsk Oblast, and Witkoff and Trump are proposing to just end the conflict right there, have a ceasefire. And I should note that Igor Strelkov, just 1 day ago, before this proposal became public, which I'm sure he wasn't even aware of, on the 24th of April, published a letter, and the letter was only maybe 3 minutes long worth of reading, a few hundred words, and he mentioned very specifically, he said the US is trying to draw out this conflict to have Russia exhausted. It's trying to continue this conflict for as long as possible through these bizarre deals, and even a temporary ceasefire with Russia will not benefit Russia in the long term. Why? Because it will allow the Ukrainians to regroup, receive more aid, move itself into more beneficial positions. And none of these agreements, Conrad, by the way, and these are a lot of Russians, including Strelkov, but also, Sergei Zadumov and other people, they've mentioned very specifically these agreements do not describe any demilitarization of Ukraine. Ukraine can continue to keep its massive 600 to 700 troops, a large army, the size of the Russian army, essentially fighting in the SMO front lines, and it'll be able to essentially bolster its air force, tank supply, etc. And the troops will receive more training, more reinvigoration, most definitely more funding. As we've seen from the Ben Shapiro interview, there most likely will not be any audits. And if anything, Ukraine will continue to be tied up essentially and plugged into the life support system in which it hangs at the moment. So a very interesting discussion with Witkoff. And it's very curious. Strelkov's letter ends with the fact that the Russian elites really want the conflict to stop. And this is why they're even entertaining this Witkoff peace talk discussion, despite the fact that they're making seemingly the best progress that they've made in a year and a half, perhaps 2 years on the front lines. It's because the elites are tired. They're tired of the economic strangulation that's happening. They're tired of the fact that they can't travel with their girlfriends and mistresses to Europe. They're tired that they're personally sanctioned, nationally sanctioned, and collectively seen as war criminals. And so a lot of these Russian elites, essentially, especially the big capitalists, the directors of major Russian public firms, they really want the conflict to end. It's not about patriotism for them. It's about money. And Strelkov said this will be essentially their political undoing in the long term. So very interesting analysis. And I think it does reflect the reality that Russia and Ukraine are in right now.
Now, the peace deal that I guess was ostensibly proposed by Trump and others, like you said, it involves recognizing Crimea. There would be no Ukraine in NATO. They say that Ukraine could still join the European Union, though, which ironically the Russians seem to not really care about. They themselves, I think, said that was okay. But despite all of this, and despite what seemed like Trump going full in on, what everyone was calling a pro-Russian peace deal, first of all, it's not really a pro-Russian peace deal. We all know that Ukraine is pretty much incapable of retaking any of these territories without much more extensive intervention from the West. So while people are calling it a pro-Russian peace deal, in reality, it's actually the most reasonable pro-Ukraine peace deal. And you mentioned Strelkov. Unfortunately, much of Strelkov's analysis is correct, and we really hope that Putin, sort of stalling, not wanting to come to a hasty agreement is ultimately a sign that the Russians are willing to establish the situation militarily on the ground. Perhaps it will get much more of a foothold in Kharkov and Sumy and whatnot. The Kursk Oblast you mentioned, Dmitry, of course, General Gerasimov, just the day we're recording this, which is on April 26th on a Saturday, he said the Kursk region has been completely liberated from Ukrainian forces. I don't know exactly how true that is, but I'm sure this means they've at least been pushed directly near the border region, and any settlements, village or otherwise, have been completely liberated from the occupiers. So that is, of course, good news. But unfortunately, as much as the news looked good regarding Trump's sort of outlook towards the conflict, this is from Anti-War. Trump tells Putin to stop after major Russian strikes on Ukrainian capital. President Trump on Thursday urged Russian President Vladimir Putin to stop following major Russian strikes on the Ukrainian capital of Kiev, which local officials said killed at least 12 people. I'm not happy with the Russian strikes on Kiev, not necessary and very bad thing. Trump wrote on Truth Social, Vladimir, stop. 5,000 soldiers a week are dying. Let's get the peace deal done. According to the Associated Press, the strikes on Kiev were the heaviest since July. At least 5 neighborhoods in the capital city were hit, and multiple residential buildings were heavily damaged. On top of the 12 people killed by the bombardment, at least 90 were wounded. The Russian Defense Ministry said that its forces carried out massive strikes on Ukraine, claiming that it targeted Ukrainian industries linked to its military. The goal of the strike has been accomplished. All targets have been hit. The Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said that Russia fired a total of 66 missiles and 145 drones. He goes on to say, I don't see any strong pressure on Russia or any new sanctions packages against Russian aggression. And of course, Trump recently, sort of in response to this, he said, maybe we need to bring back more sanctions. Maybe we need to target different Russian industries and these sorts of things. Because we remember when the initial tariff package, which has effectively been rolled back, came out, Russia really wasn't targeted any more than the baseline tariffs that all countries had put on them. So it's clear that a lot of people, I think even Witkoff included, are very excited and willing to make a deal and make concessions towards the Russians. Of course, the fact that Israelis and Jews are excited about that does give us some pause, and I think is why someone like Strelkov needs to be listened to carefully, because he, of course, we know is not Jewed up, as it were. And if he is talking about how this is going to be more like a Minsk III, then that's something that we need to listen to. But, both sides don't like it being a Minsk III. Both sides use that as a sort of, I don't want to say pejorative, but as a sort of negative sign, because, Russians are like, if it's another Minsk III, of course, the Ukrainians and the West will just violate it. And then the Ukrainians say, well, if it's another Minsk III, what will stop the Russians from invading again? Which, they have a point in the sense that the original Minsk agreements obviously did nothing to stop the special military operation from starting. So it's a very dynamic situation, and there's just no way to separate it, I think, from the Iran negotiations, which we are going to talk about in a second. But before we get too far ahead of ourselves, I want to make sure everybody watches our latest Ether Hour episode with Dave Riley. Of course, the other big news that occurred sort of since our previous episode has been not just the death of Pope Francis, but all the news about the papal conclave and who the next pope will be. And obviously, we're Orthodox Christians. We know the Pope and the Catholic Church are heretics, but to cover who the next pope is going to have a lot of effect on future ecumenist dialogue, potential for, false unions. It is still that year 2025, so anything could happen. And we know that Patriarch Bartholomew, Patriarch Kirill, these people love interacting with the popes of Rome. So we can't say that it isn't geopolitically relevant or relevant to Western civilization. So check out our Ether Hour episode with Dave Riley. It's going to be linked down below. We discuss all of this stuff, papal politics, the Jesuits, Opus Dei, how papal conclaves work, and all those sorts of things. So be sure to check that out. It's a really good episode. Now, there was even the Russian Minister of Culture was even present at Pope Francis's funeral. So between that and the Palestinian flags, say what you will about Pope Francis, very liberal, globalist, probably involved in a lot of corruption. But when it came to Russia, Ukraine, and Israel, Palestine, he really wasn't the worst. There definitely could have been a pope who was eager to side with Ukraine, because, of course, all of the Uniates, the Ukrainian Greek Catholics, they all, of course, hate Russia and the SMO. And then, of course, the Israel-Palestine situation. Obviously, we know there is heavy Jewish infiltration of the Vatican. So, again, not trying to praise Pope Francis, but if he deserves praise for anything, it was his sort of neutrality when it came to the Zionist wars, both in Ukraine and in the Middle East. But as far as this deal goes with the Russians, the big news as well is having to do with Pope Francis, that Trump and Zelensky finally met again after their disastrous Oval Office meeting. That, in his interview with Ben Shapiro, for example, very recent, Zelensky admitted that it was very bad for Ukraine. It went poorly. But on top of that, he said all sorts of things like, we're open to a full audit. Every dollar that Ukraine has received is accounted for, which we all know is a lie. But, following the Ben Shapiro meeting at the Vatican, he met with Donald Trump. I believe Steve Chung and some other people helped facilitate this to happen. And even Keir Starmer and Macron briefly joined the meeting for a bit of an exchange. It was sort of out in the open. It wasn't exactly in the most private area, so we can't say that it was comprehensive, but Zelensky definitely did the rounds. He also had a much more private meeting, I think also at the Vatican with Macron himself. And supposedly Trump and Zelensky say they came to all sorts of conclusions. It was the first time it sounded like Trump actually preferred Zelensky to Putin in the context of all of his recent condemnations of Putin and his frustration that the Russians clearly are, I think, at best stalling regarding these deals. Now that the Kursk region has been retaken, perhaps we might see the Russians come out more diplomatically, which, as far as I'm concerned, would be bad news, because any deal that doesn't at least have, of course, the full oblasts, as well as, like Strelkov said, demilitarization of Ukraine, no NATO, is going to be far from having been worth the death toll that, the Russian people took fighting this war. And I think if the Russians, I mean, maybe not if they were smart, but if the Russians just wanted to actually do this, they're going to need to plan a much larger offensive into Kharkov, into Sumy, Chernigov, all of these places. And ultimately, I think whether it be fully annexed or at least have some kind of operational control of all of Ukraine's land east of the Dnieper River, as well as all of the Black Sea coast, I think people like us and others are going to be very critical if that is not what happens. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on the frontline situation, Dmitry, because obviously, like you said, Kursk has been retaken, but there's still fighting happening everywhere. As Trump pointed out, thousands of troops dying every day.
Yes, of course. And in Kursk, that final little strip of land, essentially a few square kilometers, Gerasimov at least has announced several hours ago that it was taken. We still haven't seen any photographic evidence of that. We haven't seen the Gornal monastery, which was one of the occupied zones actually because that area was called Gornal. And it'll be interesting to see what the Ukrainians have done to that monastery, because so far, a lot of the news coming out of Kursk, there's Russians investigating the various villages, churches, lots of desecration. The Ukrainians, at least the ones that have taken Kursk and held it for, more than, I believe, 200 days, definitely brought a lot of havoc and have disrupted life there. A lot of citizens were taken as prisoners. Many of them were left and abused. Lots of indecencies, which probably are not worth describing here, but there's a lot of war crimes which the Russians are uncovering now. And frankly, the justice for those war crimes is also not on Witkoff's discourse list. Neither is so-called debanderization. I want to call it that because denazification sounds a little bit silly, despite the fact that the 9th of May is soon approaching, and we have a list already of the invitees who will be arriving to Moscow on the 9th of May, including the leader of Burkina Faso. I'm not sure what Burkina Faso had to do with World War II, but in any case, a guest of honor, shall we say. But very curious that apparently Germany as well, Conrad, has banned the sort of communist red flag, well, the flag of the Red Army, shall we say, for the 9th of May celebrations, which has offended the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And that's kind of what they're focusing on rather than the looming church persecution, which I think we'll discuss towards the end of the episode. There's definitely a lot of very troubling news in that regard. But the front lines, it's very positional, not much movement on the Volchansk-Lipetsk area in Kharkov, right? Again, remember Kharkov was on the agenda for Witkoff. He stated that all of Kharkov needed to be given back to Ukraine. And everything that Russia gained in Volchansk or Lipetsk or all of those areas surrounding the highway, the rivers, everything would needed to be given back to Ukraine. The Russians would need to leave, which is great because in some capacity, like this particular territory is not constitutionally Russian. So as much as, I think it would reasonably, for President Putin, this would fall under his consideration. He'd be happy to sort of have his troops move back. But in areas like Krasny Liman, Kupiansk, the Russians essentially are just fighting over some major highways, trying to stop Ukrainian supplies from going to the front lines. And we see the same trend actually in the long-suffering Pokrovsk, which hasn't been besieged yet. And it's actually going at a snail pace. Pokrovsk it's very interesting because the Russians essentially, as I said, control about 50% of the areas surrounding Pokrovsk in like some sort of up-facing crescent, like an arc along the southern end. They're moving along the left point of that crescent, going north. And essentially their main aim at this point is not even a full surround of Pokrovsk, but it's to wrap around from the left side and cut off 2 or 3 of the major highways. The Kotelny Highway, which is next to the village of Zverevo, where the Ukrainians are heavily fighting against Russians right now. And I guess the point of cutting off these highways in the long term, if this is going to be a very long siege of Pokrovsk, is to make sure, of course, no reinforcements, ammunition, and other medical supplies and things like this get into the Ukrainians' positions and probably holding down in Pokrovsk. Because, as we can imagine, a lot of these cities have been turned into literal World War II, maybe even World War One style strongholds. And, besieging them takes a very long time, as we saw in Torietsk and Chasiv Yar, sometimes up to 6 months, which is absolutely incredible. Because this year, frankly, this Russo-Ukrainian war, Conrad, will be reaching its World War One, World War II duration. I believe in December, January, this will be a longer conflict than the Russian Great Patriotic War. So there's definitely a lot to consider. And I do have some personal updates as well, which I received from family members on the front lines. Keep my uncle in your prayers. His name is Roman. He's not the youngest, but he's being mobilized to sent to the front lines. I believe most likely to somewhere in the north in the Kursk Oblast. So he's going to be sent to the front lines in about a week or two, in fact. So keep Roman in your prayers. He's an Orthodox Christian. In fact, a lot of the knowledge I have on the Roman and the Byzantine Empire is from the books which he gave me when I was a young child. So a lot of that great Russian historical Orthodox literature he actually gifted to me. So Roman's going to fight for the Russian Federation very soon. And I also had other news, like a former boss of mine, her nephew actually was killed under Kursk. And in order to identify his body, because look, apparently when you die on the front lines, if there's some sort of explosion and the body is disfigured or maimed in some capacity, the relatives of the deceased they have to send a DNA sample to the frontline morgues or the hospitals located therein where these bodies are stored. And the main investigator told the sister of my former boss that they have 55,000 unidentified bodies currently held across the entire SMO front line, which haven't been identified yet in these various morgues and storage rooms, which is a staggering figure. If that's strictly for the Russian force, that means the Russian losses, I'm assuming, would be beyond 100,000 at this point. There are also fragments of bodies, legs, arms, etc., which obviously will take a lot longer to identify. So that's just news from like an anecdotal standpoint. There are people still perishing. The fighting is maybe not as brutal as it is in Gaza, where essentially you have deaths of civilians. Like this week, for example, only one civilian death on the Russian side is recorded in the Zaporozhye area. Essentially, a cluster munition exploded, killing a civilian near Energodar, actually, near the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. So on the Russian side of Zaporozhye. So the civilian deaths are quite low, in fact, and which is a great thing. But nevertheless, in the greater scheme of things, this war has been extremely, I would say, detrimental to the population of both countries. And I think the Eastern European Slavic genophont in general. And yeah, there's probably a lot to discuss on that end. But in terms of drones and actually Ukrainians flying drones and Russians flying drones at one another, this is one of the key points of interest. The Russians actually shot down close to 80 drones over 5 different regions across the SMO zone and the Black Sea. So Ukrainians are flying between 50 and 100 drones every single day, trying to get around Russian air defenses. And the Russian air defenses are shooting these drones down. Again, these drones can fly very long distances, as we know. Some of them have flown all the way to the Volga River, which is absolutely insane if you think about it. That's similar to those drones that Iran flew all the way to Israel, which boggles the imagination and mind as to how exactly they can retain radio sort of signal control. It's completely fascinating. And the Russians, in fact, launched 100 Geran drones on the 25th of April, striking all kinds of Ukrainian regions, 6 of them in total, the Pavlograd, Vandry mechanical plant, all these energy plants. Of course, the industrial zone of Kharkov as well, because remember, Kharkov was the industrial heart of, if Donetsk was like the energy hub of the USSR, Kharkov, even during World War I and pre-World War I, was one of the Russian major industrial cities in the West. I think it was the most industrialized city alongside Kiev, and had a lot of the outskirts of Kharkov are actually huge factories going back to Russian imperial times. And the Kharkov tank plants actually created a lot of the tractors, tanks, all kinds of munitions and things like this for the Russian army before the Second World War. One, Stalin was, of course, rebuilding the Red Army, which was huge. And if you consider a lot of those factories, if you look at Mariupol, for example, a lot of those factories made for great defenses when Mariupol was besieged. So there's a lot to take into consideration if Kharkov was ever to be besieged by the Russians. And we know that the Ukrainians have been preparing very diligently for the Kharkov siege for more than 3 years now. So if in terms of modern warfare, what exactly will happen if the Russians continue to push their advantage, which I think they should, because at this point, any sort of Minsk-free agreements will be, I agree with Strelkov and you, Conrad, it'll be temporary at best. And yeah, we'll definitely be seeing what's happening. So we'll have to cover this sort of step by step. But in general, the front lines have been stable. The best and the greatest success that Russia has been seeing is, of course, in the Sumskoye Oblast, where Russia has taken several villages and moves very swiftly through the Sumskoye Oblast. It is more or less heavily forested. Some areas, there are these strips of forest which are really dense. The Russians during the Second World War used Sumskoye Oblast as a big base of guerrilla warfare tactics, essentially, against the Third Reich. And the Ukrainians most likely will be using that as well, although we have no signs of Ukrainians using these forested areas for sort of guerrilla tactics as of yet. And hopefully they never do, because that can turn extremely savage, if you can imagine. But the Russians, yeah, have essentially created a buffer zone between the Kurskoye Oblast and the Sumskoye Oblast, this really large strip of land. Apparently the Russian officials and the political commentators are stating that Russia is not looking to capture the Sumskoye Oblast. They're looking to create a buffer zone to prevent any further Ukrainian marauder-type incursions into Kursk. So this is almost like a policing territory of sorts. They're trying to move the front line further back, away from their own villages, away from their own lands, which makes sense because Ukraine has been using these borderline territories in the north against Bryansk, Kursk, Belgorod as for these demoralization raiding tactics, which we've seen for the past 2.5 years at the very least. And of course, the Kursk 200 plus day occupation was the biggest example of that. So very interesting progress, but again, very steady, successful. Kherson, Zaporozhye are incredibly quiet this time of year. Besides, of course, Energodar, Ukrainians trying to sort of bombard it, the outskirts of that city and town. Very interesting. We look forward to more news about Pokrovsk, Kupiansk, some of these key cities with huge highways leading to greater gains for the Russians. But at the moment, Russia is looking quite satisfied with these gradual incremental gains that it's taking. And it looks like Russia's definitely, under Andrei Belousov, the new defense minister, is following a particular textbook strategy. It's not random. For whatever reason, the Russians are taking a very gradual approach to how they handle the frontline situation. So hopefully it's going according to plan.
Yeah, I think, again, in some of these places, Kherson, Zaporozhye, everyone sort of knows, like, the next logical step has to be a plan to take city of Kherson, city of Zaporozhye themselves. And I think that's sort of the big obstacle that's on the planning table for these generals, is how are we going to do this? What soft power mechanisms are we going to use? Again, remember, at the beginning of the special military operation, there was a sort of expectation that perhaps Kiev would surrender, and that relied a lot on, Russian agents, people that were sympathetic to the Russian side in these cities sort of emerging. I mean, we know, like, the civilian government in Kherson, Stremousov, some of these characters that we have praised heavily on the show, these were, people already in Ukraine that the Russians knew they could utilize. And unfortunately, in places like Zaporozhye and Kherson at this point, I don't know if any of those people are left. They've either been arrested or martyred by the Ukrainian state, or have fled, like, the 70,000 or whatever it was, many, many thousands of people in Kherson that have, fled over to the Russian side of the occupation there. So we have to follow this closely, not just militarily, but also politically, because these are cities with mayors and councils and everything where people are going to be vying for power. But the other big piece of news, of course, is the Russian general who was killed by a car bomb in Moscow before U.S. talks. This is from Kyle Anzalone. He says a top Russian military commander was killed by a car bomb near Moscow. The heavy attack happened just hours before U.S. envoy Steve Witkoff met with Russian President Vladimir Putin. On Friday, Lieutenant General Yaroslav Moskalik was killed by a car bomb in Balashika, a city near Moscow. He served as deputy chief of the main operations directorate of the General Staff of the Russian Armed Forces. According to TASS, Russian officials say Moskalik was the only person killed by the blast. Authorities believe the bomb was an IED containing submunitions and had the power of more than 300 grams of TNT. Russian Foreign Ministry spokesperson Maria Zakharova called the bombing a terrorist attack. The main question is how to stop the war in the center of Europe, the world. We see so many victims every day, she said. Even today, a Russian general was killed in a terrorist attack in Moscow. Ukraine has conducted similar bombings in Russia throughout the war. So, of course, this is probably the biggest high-profile assassination within Russia ever since the head of sort of the Russian nuclear capabilities was assassinated. I'm forgetting his name. That was a few months ago as well. But this is one of the highest-ranking generals currently serving in the Russian armed forces. Dmitry, I don't know if you have any comments on this man or what his untimely demise may mean for the war effort.
Well, I did note that Moskalik, or at least General Moskalik, was slain on the 25th of April or the 26th of April. So essentially the anniversary date 2 years since the killing of Vladlen Maxim Tatarsky as well. Remember that? So it was almost like a suicide bombing. The toy that was given to him, essentially like a little statue of a bomb inside of it in the cafe in St. Petersburg, which it's almost as if the Ukrainians plan to have these, terrorist attacks somewhat align at the same dates. Maybe it has something to do with the Ukrainians, of course, being so deeply engrossed in numerology, witchcraft, and all these other things, which we know these are the most prosperous religions amongst the degenerate class of the Ukrainian elites, right? They literally have occultists running things in Kiev, both, Jewish occultists and pagans. But in any case, what's really noteworthy is the fact that General Moskalik, he has been the most senior Russian official to have been killed to date. And he was actually, given that he was on the operational logistics and for the Russians working in this particular capacity, he was essentially one of the people on the military general staff to plan this special military operation before 2022, technically. Like, he would have been preparing for the SMO during the COVID years. And for Ukraine to target him specifically, it also shows that Moscow is the capital of Russia, this should be the safest city, the most developed, the most economically prosperous city across all of Russia is just simply not safe. As you said before we recorded, Conrad, it also points to the fact that Ukrainians are still technically Russians because they can blend in so well. It's not like it's probably way easier than even the Israeli spies and assets trying to infiltrate Hamas in Gaza or, for example, Hezbollah in Lebanon. For Ukrainians to appear as Russians, it takes almost no effort at all, perhaps maybe an adjustment of an accent at most. And so you probably do have a lot of these SBU agents and all kinds of other degenerates literally living in Moscow apartments, preparing some of these. This won't be the only terrorist attack we discussed today, unfortunately. So terrorism really has been on this agenda in this bright week, unfortunately. But very key that this Russian general has been essentially killed. There's no answer from the Russian executive branch. It seems that Russians are not looking to have this stall the peace talks with Witkoff at all, right? So the fact that it happened on the same day as Witkoff arriving is very similar perhaps to the Prigozhin revolt taking place in the same year, just several months away from the BRICS summit, which took place in Kazan, or even the fact that Prigozhin's plane a month and a half before the Kazan happened, blew up over Tver. A lot of these terrorist attacks were essentially made to demoralize not just the Russian government and the Russian elites, showing them that, look, it's not just the people on the front lines that aren't safe. It's actually members of the higher classes in Russia, or I guess the middle upper class, the officers, they're not safe. So a lot of the Russian elites maybe this attack will prompt them to take Witkoff's considerations even more seriously. It won't necessarily agitate them and force them to have a more warlike position on Ukraine, Conrad. It'll do the opposite. Maybe Russian elites will be more scared, and in fact, they'd want the war to end sooner rather than later, because again, it appears that the FSB is not able to foil any of at least some of the plans of the SBU, at least of the terrorist attacks being conducted in cities like Moscow. So incredibly, incredibly rough sort of time for the Russians, because they're in this war for the long haul. The strategy on the front line clearly shows that they're taking their actions step by step. They're not rushing. But at the same time, the longer it takes, the more opportunities, the more chinks in the armor appear in Russian defenses, and the more opportunities the Ukrainians can take in, of course, striking key targets such as General Moskalik. But keep in mind, there are hundreds of generals in the Russian army. He's just the most senior one killed to date. So again, this is a direct murder. It could have killed civilians. It's similar to the pager explosions used by Israel. His Golf Volkswagen exploded. Essentially, it's just fortunate that there were no other civilians around, but still, he could have had family in his car as well. So it's just quite stark as to how the Ukrainians operate with these particular explosions. Really shows in some way as to which side is fighting for good Christian moral ethics, because the Russians really haven't been using any such terrorist tactics against the Ukrainians, and they certainly could have. The Russians, if anything, have a very potent spy, FSB, espionage network within Ukraine, and they haven't been using these tactics, which I think says a lot. And that's probably one of the reasons why me and Conrad really advocate for essentially more Christian ethics and warfare. And to some extent, the Russians have been showing that to follow those tenets very, very carefully. And frankly, besides some of the, I would say, maybe careless drone explosions here or there killing civilians, and long-range bombardments, there haven't been any direct terrorist strikes against the Ukrainian key leaders, which I think speaks volumes about who exactly motivates Ukrainian actions. And it's certainly the motivation comes from a demonic source.
I completely agree. And you mentioned Yevgeny Prigozhin. There's some news out of Kyrgyzstan, actually. Viktor Vasilyev Lukovenko, a former top official of PMC Wagner and a close associate of Prigozhin, has been arrested in Kyrgyzstan on suspicion of working as a mercenary. And I don't know all of the details about this, but I wouldn't be surprised if perhaps Central Asia was where some of these more private military contractors that have now been subtly and covertly incorporated into the Russian military apparatus, that they would be operating in some of these Central Asian countries, which have become not only the location and the origin of the people that did the Crocus City Hall attack, of certain people that are going to Ukraine and fighting, but also huge amounts of people that went and helped overthrow the Assad regime and fought with al-Jalani, al-Shara. They came from Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, some of these places where they have been radicalized into this Wahhabist, Israeli-backed nonsense that serves to turn many Muslim countries that would otherwise be enemies of Israel towards the side of world Jewry, the Greater Israel Project, and this sort of Sunni golem that exists there right now. But that relates to the Pakistan-India situation, which we are going to talk about later after we talk about the rest of the Middle Eastern stuff. But unfortunately, there is the Pakistani black pill even outside of that region, which is the news from many people probably saw it. I think it would have been discussed last week if we had done a show, but it was apparently the headline was Lukashenko in Belarus to welcome 150,000 Pakistani laborers. And I don't know if that's exactly 100% true, but unfortunately, the Belarusians are in bilateral talks with Pakistan for Pakistani corporations and firms to overtake many Belarusian textile and other production manufacturing facilities. And they say that there will be specialists from Pakistan that will come, I guess ostensibly workers. So I guess we're getting basically the H-1B Belarus version, which again, I really hope it's nothing like 150,000. Everybody always craps on Lukashenko and Belarus for supposedly weaponizing migrants at the Polish border. But ultimately, I mean, if I was Belarus, wouldn't you want to send the migrants to Poland as well if they've already made it up to Belarus through Ukraine, Serbia, Hungary, these other places? What are you going to do? Obviously, it'd be best to send them back to where they came from, but it's also easier just to immediately push them over to the border towards your geopolitical enemy of Poland, who, again, I think, I don't know which country is whiter or not, but I think Belarus is actually one of the whitest countries in Europe. So they have, in some capacity, resisted the Great Replacement. But we got to say no to 150,000 Pakistanis. Lukashenko, anybody at the Belarusian embassy or his office that listens to this in Minsk, please let him know that we cannot be, doing the Kalirgi plan in Belarus. That's my perspective on that. But unless you have anything to say about the Russia situation, Dimitri, we do have to move to the Middle East, which obviously at this point, the Ukraine wars and the potential war with Iran, as well as the Gaza war, are intricately interconnected to the point where if one of them was resolved, it would very much affect the other, considering, obviously there's the fact that the US and the West are spread thin with who they can supply right now. But even more than that, world Jewry is very much playing both of these conflicts off of each other, trying to achieve not just the greater Israel situation in the Middle East, but also a situation much more preferable to world Jewry as a whole. We've obviously talked about New Heavenly Jerusalem, but in general, they are trying to make sure the dialectic between the West and the multipolar East, the multipolar world, does not emerge as one where one side, for example, is against Israel and the other is in favor of Israel. That's why, again, Stephen Witkoff, the Jewish envoy to Russia, Benjamin Netanyahu himself, these characters have always made sure to never just come out and openly condemn Russia, to explicitly side with Ukraine. We know the Israelis have secretly supplied Ukraine with weapons. We know that the same situation applies with Turkey, obviously, but I believe there is a very strong effort to prevent a Jewish versus anti-Jewish dialectic from emerging, because then that would, a lot of people, I think, would become sympathetic with a side that was, not just within the Middle East from the Muslim perspective, but that is generally against Zionism and this sort of Jewish fifth column that exists across the entire world. But the big headline coming out of the Middle East negotiations, this is from Fox News, Trump says he'll be leading the pack to war with Iran if deal prospects wither away. And this comes from a tweet that started off really strong, and then, or rather a Truth Social post that then kind of went the wrong direction. The post was, Trump said, Netanyahu and Israel will not drag me and the United States into war with Iran. And I was like, amazing. This is one of the most This is one of the best developments I've seen from Trump in a long time. But of course, immediately following that in the same post, he says, if things go that way, he will be leading the pack. So he's sort of, as far as I can tell, this tweet is basically an admission that we will go to war with Iran. And when it happens, Trump just doesn't want you to think that he's doing it on the leash of Israel, but that he's doing it for, really sincere America first reasons. Definitely not because Netanyahu told me to. And of course, when you pair this with the fact that Netanyahu, Israeli media, the IDF have all this week openly been saying that regardless of how the Iran negotiations go, regardless of even if the U.S. won't just approve, but will help us at all on these strikes, Israel is prepared to strike Iran's nuclear capabilities unilaterally without approval or assistance from the United States, which, again, if the immediate response to that to the United States isn't to immediately condemn, sanction, restrain Israel, then we know who is really holding the power here. It is Israel. If Israel can openly sabotage negotiations between the United States and its regional rival Iran, then the Israelis are the ones that have been in control from the very beginning. And unfortunately, we've heard factionalism inside the DoD, the State Department, and the White House. You've got Pete Hegseth, Steve Witkoff, apparently, obviously he's more involved with the Russian situation, but he's also involved in the Iranian negotiations. They seem to be more interested in making a deal, not going to war with Iran, whereas Marco Rubio, Mike Waltz, and obviously all of the Israel-aligned people desperately do want to escalate this to a regional war with Iran. I think under a false perception that we will actually be able to treat them like the Houthis, where we can just sort of bomb them, deplete their capabilities, and then through some form of soft power or otherwise, the regime will simply be overthrown in Tehran. And I don't think people realize how gross of a miscalculation that is. Iran is a heavily mountainous country. They have an entrenched regime that's been in power for well over 40 years at this point. They are the religious stronghold of Shia Islam. So there are many civilizational factors that are going to prevent them from just folding, like paper at the moment the United States decides to do what it wants to do. But this is from the Jerusalem Post, which of course is a very Likud-aligned outlet. It gives us a perspective into the Israeli mind. It says, as Iran-U.S. nuclear talks take place in Oman, hopes begin to falter since last week, which of course a Likud outlet would want to report on the talks supposedly faltering. This says Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi and U.S. Middle East envoy Steve Witkoff are in Oman for another round of indirect talks. This is the third meeting. The first meeting also took place in Oman in April. The second meeting took place on April 19th in Rome. While hopes were high at the first and second meetings, some of those hopes appeared to fade in the last week. Iran has sought to balance these hopes by working with Russia and China. Iran is also seeking to mediate between India and Pakistan after a terror attack on tourists in Kashmir. We're going to talk more about that later. Representatives from Iran and the United States commenced the third round of indirect negotiations in Muscat, Oman, focusing on the lifting of anti-Iran sanctions, Iran's state media IRNA said on April 26th. Oman's foreign minister Badr bin Hamad bin Hamoud al-Busaida, oh my gosh, what a name, is mediating the discussions, which center on disputes related to Iran's nuclear program. This round of talks includes expert and technical discussions. The expert delegation is being led by Majid Takht-e-Revanchi, Deputy of Political Affairs, and Kazem Garibabadi, Deputy for Legal and International Affairs, both from the Iranian Foreign Ministry. The third round of talks is expected to deal with technical issues. This could be more complex than the first two rounds of talks, which were kind of a way for both sides to judge if the other is serious. Of course, we know that the Iranians consider it a non-starter for them to be asked to completely stop their uranium enrichment program. Obviously, they have never claimed to have already developed a nuclear weapon. So all these boisterous talks about we will get them to promise to never make nukes, they were never even talking about that. They are just trying to protect their civilian nuclear program. And they do also recognize that I think being a threshold state, having potential to go nuclear is, obviously a deterrent towards hostile regimes that want to overthrow them. So I'm sure the Iranians are, playing it subtly a little bit. I think they do want to have the capability to enrich uranium to weapons grade levels. But again, we've said it a million times on the show. The Supreme Leader, the Ayatollah, does have a fatwa, a restriction against the creation of nuclear weapons. So even if they wanted to, that would have to be lifted before Iran really wanted to go nuclear. But the Jerusalem Post article mentioned technical talks, and that's followed up on by anti-war Dave DeCamp. It says that U.S. State Department official to lead technical talks with Iran, and that U.S. State Department official is Michael Anton, the State Department's policy planning director, who will lead technical talks with Iranian officials in Oman this Sunday. Anton will lead dozens of U.S. officials in talks that will focus on the details of a potential nuclear deal before U.S. envoy Steve Witkoff and Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi hold another round of negotiations. So this was sort of the preliminary setting the stage for things. And for anybody that knows who Michael Anton is, you got to realize this is suspicious. People, if you watch Nick Fuentes or others, you might be familiar with this, but Michael Anton is one of the main guys at the Claremont Institute. Apparently, he was supposed to be Trump's national security advisor, but things got in the way, and eventually I believe Mike Waltz took the spot. But ever since Signalgate happened, and Mike Waltz, of course, had Jeffrey Goldberg from The Atlantic in the chat, of course, the whole viral leaking about the Yemeni strikes. Some say that Michael Anton is getting ready to replace Mike Waltz. And Michael Anton, not only was he at the Claremont Institute, which of course is a Straussian outlet funded by Peter Thiel, and Straussianism, of course, is pretty much the Jewish manifestation of pro-Western civilization, philosophy, and historicization. Very much you could almost call it the right-wing post-war consensus, where, the values of Western civilization and philosophy are extolled. But fundamentally, the reason that they are important is because they will prevent another Holocaust or protect the Jews or something like that. That's sort of the base of Straussianism. And Michael Anton, he was the one who pretty much injected Bronze Age mindset by Costin Alamariu, known online as Bronze Age Pervert. He's the one that had Bronze Age Pervert on for an interview. He reviewed Bronze Age mindset, brought it sort of into the conservative milieu. He's the reason why people in the White House in Trump's first term were supposedly reading this book. So for those that are familiar with the sort of Peter Thiel, Curtis Yarvin, BAP sphere that, have been very influential recently, they're in many ways the force behind J.D. Vance. They're the force behind a lot of these, national populist people that are very willing to dog whistle towards, white identitarianism, but the moment you, of course, begin to criticize Israel, they want nothing to do with it. They'll call you a third worldist, all these sorts of things. So very interesting development that Michael Anton is getting closer and closer involved with these Iran talks. But I think ultimately we will see sometime this year, I'm not betting on it, but I think it's very likely that this year we will see, potentially in a very surprising way, in a day we don't even expect, that the Israelis have gone ahead and struck Iran's nuclear capabilities without the blessing or approval of the United States. What do you think, Dimitri?
I think it's very likely. And look, given Steve Witkoff, right, this essentially Ashkenazi Jew from the East Coast in America, how is it possible that someone who doesn't have any real formal training, never worked for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in the United States or any other country, is literally the top diplomat in the world right now? It really shows you as to which particular ethnic group or tribe you need to have an allegiance with in order to be a successful, envoy or ambassador in the modern world, doesn't it? I mean, it really shows you as to who really operates and behind the scenes and sort of even ties many of these nations together. And it's shocking. He is literally the guy representing the America in Russia, Ukraine, and Iran as well in the Middle East. Really, either he's incredibly talented or this is just a little bit on the nose, no pun intended, and we're really witnessing a really dominant show of force from this particular group of people, right? So I think it says a lot, but definitely I think Israel, despite the fact that True Strike Promise 2 has never really come into fruition by Iran. There's no real retaliation. Iran has definitely taken the Dr. Pezeshkian path, right? The president of Iran and the people backing him have taken a more liberal, maybe more lukewarm, peaceful stance towards the threats that Iran faces today. And I think that's a wise move. I'm not going to call that cowardice. Technically, Iran has already done a lot for the Palestinians and for their allies in Syria and Hezbollah, but many of us just have to admit that Iran has lost a huge grip on the axis of resistance with the fall of Syria. That was a huge blow, I think, to future prospects of, say, resisting the Zionist occupation of many Middle Eastern countries and their influence positions, as well as the Holy Land itself. So Iran really needs to reconsider and reposition itself. Maybe even, again, the country is still under heavy sanctions. It's still economically, unfortunately enough, it still deals with Russia and China, who are bolstering it economically, but the country is not in a strong enough position to withstand the entire Western world plus Israel. And again, potentially even the Gulf states such as Saudi Arabia. Because notice, if Iran falls, the oil prices will most likely skyrocket. The Gulf states will benefit economically. And you know which other countries will benefit economically from that, from increased oil and probably gas prices in the world? Unfortunately, Russia. So there's literal economic motivations to so to speak, betray Iran. Potentially, hopefully it doesn't go that way. But again, a lot of pressure from Iran. And I think Iran really doesn't have any close allies. It is the only major, as you said, Conrad, the only major Shia state in the world. Obviously, Azerbaijan is also majority Shia. However, really, we know Azerbaijan cannot be trusted. We've covered this many times before. They're very snakish, very tribe of Danish in terms of their allegiances and how they behave. And of course, the tribe of Dan, where was its home in the Holy Land at one point? It was in Gush Dan, where Tel Aviv is located today, coincidentally. So that should pretty much tell us all we need to know. And also in terms of the general theme in the Middle East at the moment, it does seem like in Syria, Iran, Iraq, it does seem to bend towards normalization, essentially admitting in some capacity that Israel is incredibly powerful, that Netanyahu has shown his hand of force in both southwestern Syria, in southern Lebanon, and in Palestine. And I don't want to take like some sort of pro-Netanyahu position, but we just have to admit that at the moment, Israel, with America's support, with the support of many other European countries, has really proven itself to be a true powerhouse in terms of, actually defeating its opponents. And yes, Israel alone would not have been able to withstand a lot of these Arab countries and their onslaughts. And frankly, I would say even we have footage very clearly of how the Israelis fight on the front lines. Without external support, Israel would not be in existence today. The Zionist entity would have been defeated long ago. However, at the moment, with Netanyahu, with international jury, literally not in the fictional sense, in the actual sense, their support for Israel has caused all of these Arab and Persian peoples around the world to really reconsider and their strengths at the moment. So you even have, like, a good example of this is the foreign minister of Syria, right? We're talking about Assad al-Shaibani. This is, he's a very interesting character, Conrad, because if you look at, for example, his Wikipedia page or any other biographies of him, official biographies, you'll note that he went to university, he received the Bachelor of Political Science and International Relations degree, and then ostensibly he joined Al-Qaeda. So it's a proper career path, I would say. If you're a Syrian rebel, you go to university, you study, you receive your textbooks, you receive a formal education, and then you join Al-Qaeda because you need practical experience in, I guess, overthrowing a regime you disagree with. And now he's the literal foreign minister, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Syria, and he traveled to New York, raised the United Nations flag. He met up, gave a speech to the Security Council, and this is key because at the Security Council meeting, he, of course, insisted that Israel stop bombing Syria. He asked very specifically, similar to Iran. Notice Iran also made statements that Israel should stop bombing Iran. Now, of course, the new al-Shara, al-Julani government is also insisting that Israel, please stop. They're begging. They're almost asking for fealty. They're saying, look, we'll get down on one knee for you. Just please stop hurting us at the moment. Look, it's a real position of weakness here, which I admit, frankly, this new terrorist regime, it is quite weak. They have destroyed their own navy, their own air defense, any sort of thing, anything resembling a proper ground army. It's essentially just a collective of various Central Asian / former Al-Qaeda, ISIS militias, and the demoralized remnants of the Syrian Arab army. So it doesn't really look too good. And of course, the Kurds really cannot be relied on in any capacity. So we haven't really seen them interact too well with some of these Central Asian mercenaries and official Arab soldiers either. So interesting developments there. But he has made a point to say that Syria at the moment, this new Ummah-led Sunni Syria, Conrad, does not pose a threat to any neighbors, including Lebanon, which again, there's a lot of Lebanese Shia refugees who are incredibly upset as to what happened in northern Syria. A lot of them had to flee for their lives to not have been executed and murdered by some of these terrorists in December of this year. In December of last year. And at the same time, countries like Jordan, again, there were calls to even overthrow the monarchy in Jordan and to bring the Muslim Brotherhood Ummah to Jordan as well, which is a bit insane given the fact that Jordan is one of the most Shabbos Goy states around in the Levant and the central Middle East area surrounding El Sham. Of course, the main country that the foreign minister placed emphasis on was Israel. He said, look, we're seeking peaceful relations with Israel. So all this talk that we saw in December of the caliphate being reborn, this official Sunni Ummah caliphate being restored in Syria, the future, the hope for Palestine as well. And Hamas even congratulated the Syrian revolutionaries in December. And now these Shabbos Goy leaders, which we had no doubt they would, they normalized of Israel. It certainly shows you there's most likely either half Jews or some sort of Mossad assets integrated deep into the Syrian oppositionary government. And of course, them essentially relying on Turkey, which we know has never broken ties with Israel, also adds add some flavor to this particular soup that they've brewed in the central Middle East. They've created a subordinate state to Israel, something that potentially in the future will be there only to provide an expansion for greater Israeli geopolitical interests. And the other interesting point, Conrad, in terms of normalization is between Iran and Syria, you have, of course, the country of Iraq, very war-torn, very weakened. It's primarily a point of it's trying to normalize with some of its neighbors. And you did have the Iraqi president actually invite al-Shara al-Jilani to the 17th of May 2025 Arab Summit, which will be taking place in Baghdad. I note, by the way, that Iraq has a huge Shia population, right? It has many Shias who disagree with ISIS, Al-Qaeda. They've been fighting against these people for a long time. And al-Shara al-Jilani still has an outstanding warrant in Iraq, placed by the government. So complete normalization of terrorists, having a terrorist, a former member of al-Nusra Front, a branch of Al-Qaeda, essentially giving a speech in the United Nations. This is where foreign policy really has deteriorated, Conrad, in all respects. In the Middle East, in Europe, we have essentially Jewish businessmen playing diplomat. We have terrorists giving speeches at the United Nations. This is a postmodern reality that we live in. And it's quite amusing to comment on these things because, again, if anything, this is entertaining. It's like, the end of the world will come and most likely there'll be a few laughs and jokes along the way. So very curious to see how all of this develops. But I just want to pivot very briefly to Gaza because essentially since March of this year, the casualties of the Gaza Palestinians have been ever mounting, ever increasing. Roughly, and I've calculated this myself, but there's been officially 2,000 Palestinians killed since the end of March, which would make it about 30 to 35 days. And according to this math, there'd be 57 Palestinians essentially killed per day. That's about one every half hour. So every 30 minutes, a Palestinian Gazan is killed by Israelis, most likely a civilian. Most of these are civilians, and a good example of that is on the 25th of April, an Israeli airstrike in western Gaza City flattened a three-story home, killing 10 civilians. And what made up that number of 10 civilians? 5 children and 3 women, 2 men, one of the men being elderly. So this is essentially what happens on a daily basis. Every day, 57 Palestinians die in the Gaza Strip. More civilians than I think at any point in the Russo-Ukrainian conflict, which is incredibly tragic because at the moment, Israel's strategy is very much a brute force tactic, as it has been for the last year and a half. What they're doing on the ground is they're trying to surround Rafah city, and they're trying to take care of the tunnels, bomb these Hamas depots. Again, Hamas has even proposed, and I think Hamas is really feeling the pressure somewhat because they've proposed essentially a temporary treaty of 5 to 7 years of peace. They're essentially facilitating Gaza's reconstruction. They've said that, look, we have 20 to 24 hostages. I think the hostages number is still at 24. So a fraction of the number of hostages that were alive at the beginning of this essentially ordeal. And Hamas is ready to surrender all of those hostages for even a temporary Minsk 1 or Minsk 2 type of ceasefire with Israel. The thing is, I don't think the Israelis are going to go for it. I think they're happy demolishing the homes of these Palestinians. I think the end goal, as we've spoken about for a few weeks now, Conrad, will be that mass deportation. They want to get rid of these people in order to, again, build homes for future Israeli migrants, most likely from all kinds of countries. If, for example, Europe begins to become more right-wing, it won't be very comfortable for some of these residents to remain in their European homes. They want to have a safe space for future Israel, again, for the second Jerusalem temple, which Ben Gvir spoke about, by the way, which maybe we'll cover a bit later on, but things are not looking too good. And frankly, the Lebanese government, the Syrian government, and the Iranian government are not looking to escalate matters with Israel at all. So this leaves us essentially with Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis. This is the remaining axis of resistance and on the front lines fighting against essentially the Zionist entity, which has killed, admittedly now, according to official sources, more than 60,000 people in the Gaza Strip, but most likely closer to 200,000 and over. So almost as many as all the combatants that died in the Russo-Ukrainian war. An incredibly serious conflict, and we really don't see an end to it at the moment.
No, what's happening in Gaza is just a tragedy that's been unfolding. I mean, we're going to hit 2 years if this keeps going by October of this year, but you mentioned the Syrian situation. Not only was, al-Jilani and the Syrian foreign minister openly talking about normalizing relations with Israel. They did this in the presence of a Republican congressman. This is also from anti-war Syria's leader Ahmed al-Shara has reportedly expressed openness to normalizing relations with Israel under certain circumstances, ending decades of acrimony between the two neighboring states. Shara reportedly discussed the matter with Rep. Corey Mills, a Republican from Florida, during his visit to Syria. The exact terms of the offer weren't made public, though Rep. Mills said that Shara also gave him a note to deliver to President Trump. Syria is keen to get international sanctions eased, and that is likely to be a top condition for such a move. Obviously, the fact that a Republican congressman, I'm sure a eager evangelical Christian Zionist, went and was taking photos with al-Jilani and Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. Very shameful for someone who claims to be a Christian to be, being seen with this butcherous regime, and even worse, trying to get them to submit to Israel and, continue to perpetuate the Greater Israel Project, which is very unfortunate. But potentially the only place being struck as heavily as Gaza right now is Yemen and the Houthis. And this is a report from Dave DeCamp. It says a U.S. official has told ABC News that the U.S. has launched about 750 airstrikes on Yemen since March 15th, a relentless bombing campaign that has failed to deter the Houthis and has taken a heavy toll on civilians. U.S. airstrikes hit multiple provinces in Yemen on Thursday, with at least 3 people wounded by U.S. attacks in the morning that hit the capital Sana'a and the northern Sada province. U.S. airstrikes on Thursday night were reported in the provinces of Marib, Sana'a, and Amran. The Houthis, officially known as Ansar Allah, are known for their resilience, having survived a U.S.-backed Saudi/UAE war from 2015 to 2022, which involved heavy airstrikes, a ground campaign, and a blockade. The Yemeni group was also not deterred by a U.S.-UK bombing campaign conducted under President Biden from January 2024 to January 2025. The only thing that was able to stop Houthi attacks on the Red Sea and Israel was the Gaza ceasefire that went into effect on January 19th, after Israel violated the deal by imposing a blockade on humanitarian aid and all other goods entering Gaza. The Houthis announced they would reimpose their blockade on Israeli shipping. And in his defense, Donald Trump recently told Netanyahu that you need to treat the people of Gaza well. They're dying. It's horrible there. You need to let in aid. Netanyahu obviously has no interest in listening. Itamar Ben-Gvir, who definitely doesn't want to let aid into Gaza. He was just in America. He met with Donald Trump. He even appeared at the Chabad Lubavitch World Headquarters, the famous synagogue where the tunnels were, and he was dancing with the Chabad people there. I am wondering if Ben-Gvir inspected the tunnels. I think he would be an expert on, why ultra-Zionist, ethno-nationalist Jews need to have escape tunnels and these sorts of things. But it is very, very unfortunate what's happening both in Yemen and in Gaza. But in Yemen, it isn't just these strikes. It appears that the UAE and the Saudi-backed governments are making more of a play. There's rumors that there will even be an offensive from the east towards western Yemen by these, I believe there's the Southern Transition Council, and there's another one. The UAE, I think, backs the Southern Transition Council, and the other one is backed by Saudi Arabia. And the very unfortunate development is that it appears that the Russians are more interested in supporting the Southern Transition Council, as they seem to have some form of relations with the UAE-backed groups. So this whole, everyone seems to want to map things on, resistance and multipolarity versus the West. But the Russians specifically, they have all sorts of convoluted alliances with different people. And not to return to the Russian sphere, but just today it was also announced by Gerasimov that not only was the Kursk territory completely liberated, but he confirmed himself. There's video, it's completely real, that yes, the Kursk front, the Kursk Oblast was liberated with the help of North Korean soldiers. He said that North Korean soldiers fought side by side, shoulder to shoulder with Russian soldiers in the region. And
Wow.
This is that confirmation. I don't necessarily believe that those 2 people in that video that the Ukrainians captured were actually from North Korea, because I think they would have made more of a big deal out of that. But it does appear that, yes, North Korean soldiers were there. They took casualties, and the Russian Ministry of Defense has acknowledged their contribution to the special military operation. So that is quite fascinating. I think we did believe that it was occurring. We just had never seen evidence, which proves that the Russians, they did a good job of concealing this, making sure that there wasn't footage of, I don't know if there were majority North Korean pushes into these areas, but, perhaps that is what happened. And so I guess respect to the North Koreans for honoring their defense treaty that they have with the Russians. I believe an Iranian treaty that did actually have defense agreements was also signed with the Russians. So I don't know if that means that Iranians are going to have to go to defend Russia, or if in the event of a ground operation against Iran on the ground from the United States or other forces, if Russians are going to be obligated to go there. But it appears that, again, despite Russia's propensity towards Israel, the UAE, these other countries, they are very much entrenched on the side of North Korea, Iran, China, and these other, very much anti-Western states. But again, as the Russia negotiations with Ukraine go on, we have always warned against the possibility of Russia being cleaved away from its multipolar friends in the East and being welcomed back into the NATO Western sphere of influence, with the understanding being that they would stop helping their more non-aligned friends. But speaking of people that play both sides, I did also want to talk about the situation with Azerbaijan. The past few weeks, we've been discussing how Israel, the United States, have been really trying to activate Azerbaijan to be their kind of base of operations against both Iran and Russia, because it's the only country that borders both of those states. We even saw Pezeshkian, I believe he or someone is going to be visiting Azerbaijan soon. He himself is an ethnic Azeri, so we've said that the new Iranian president might mark a sea change there, because of course, historically, Iran and Azerbaijan very much enemies, despite both being Shia. Iran conducts joint operations, military exercises with Armenia, of course, with an understanding being that it is a show of force against Azerbaijan. But ultimately, Azerbaijan, they seem to be good lobbyists. They seem to be willing to be friends with everybody. Obviously, they're one of the main oil and energy providers for Israel, along with their big brother, Turkey. They also, I still am convinced they might have had something to do with the death of Raisi, the former president of Iran. But unlike other Turkic states, for example, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and Kyrgyzstan, which I think we reported on last week, they refused to recognize Northern Cyprus and recognized the Greek Republic of Cyprus as the sole sovereign entity over the entire island of Cyprus, just off the coast of Israel and Lebanon. Whereas, and this is from Turkey Today, Aliyev voices support for Turkish Cyprus recognition at Global Forum. The Azerbaijan President Ilham Aliyev declared his country's full support for the international recognition of the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus, speaking at the Towards a New World Order International Forum held at the ADA University in Baku. What a great name for a conference, Towards a New World Order. I'm sure there's nothing satanic or globalist being discussed there. But Aliyev emphasized that Azerbaijan would always stand with the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus, saying, "We are always with our brothers. Our brothers in the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus can rest assured that we will always support the recognition of their country as an independent state by the international community." Aliyev recalled Azerbaijan's role in supporting TRNC's observer status in the Organization of Turkic States and noted that Turkish Cyprus resident Ersin Tatar was invited to the informal summit in Shusha. Obviously, Azerbaijan seems to be the only Turkic state standing by Turkey against this sort of surprising move that enraged Ankara, where they, refused to recognize the TRNC, these other Turkic states. But we have predicted for years on the show now that Azerbaijan will obviously be the first country, if there ever is an international recognition of the TRNC, Azerbaijan will be the first to do so. So interesting development there. I always find it interesting to connect that conflict, the Cyprus, NATO, Greece, Turkey situation with the other ways that Azerbaijan is playing an important role in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, obviously its conflict with Armenia, and of course, the Iran situation. But if you have any thoughts perhaps on the North Korean troops in Russia or the Azerbaijan situation, or really anything else going on in the Middle East with Yemen or Gaza, Dimitri, let's hear it before we discuss India-Pakistan.
No, I think it's very important to note that the Pakistan, the Muslim question, again, will be raised many, many times into the future. We've seen even the Pakistani rape gangs, right, in the UK. The only reason they were raised by the mainstream media, including Elon Musk on X, and by all these other big people who were opposing Keir Starmer, for example, was because, again, they needed to rile up anti-Islamic sentiments amongst Europeans in order for the growth of support for Israel, and the Tommy Robinson narrative needed to be pushed. Not saying that Tommy Robinson was wrong about everything in the UK, but this entire anti-Pakistan rhetoric, anti-Islamist rhetoric has a purpose to it. And we've had, in fact, I've posted it on my X page, and now on the 26th of April, I'm actually, just after this recording, going to repost a video of Israeli Zionists, essentially in Russian on Israeli television in 2012, admitting that in order to deal for the final solution over the Palestinian issue, they need to rile up anti-Islamic sentiments in Europe. And they allude and infer the fact that potentially this is why the colloquification of Europe is taking place. They're shipping Muslims to Europe to grow anti-Islamic sentiments among Europeans so that Europe inevitably and to their own detriment in the long term supports Israel as their only anti-Islamic ally in the Middle East. Very devious. And again, the Pakistani angle kind of adds to this as well. which is we'll discuss this. But the huge civilizational question, Conrad, it always arises. Even, for example, you can see why the IRGC is having these joint exercises with the Armenian troops. It's because Armenia itself, before Tiridates III, Saint Tiridat, actually, Saint Tiridates, before he converted to Orthodox Christianity by Saint Gregory the Enlightener, before even Constantine the Great converted to Orthodoxy, he was a Zoroastrian. Armenians have this long sort of lineage. They are an Indo-European sort of people related to that larger Mesopotamian and Zoroastrian family group. So they are in some ways culturally, according to ancient lore and history, related to the Persians and Iranians, which I think will account for a lot of things before, of course, they converted to Christianity. And I think in the long term, perhaps we will see some sort of Armenian-Iranian collaboration. And you know who tried to also civilizationally analyze a lot of things? Donald Trump. Donald Fredovich made a few mistakes in his statements regarding India and Pakistan and the recent escalations therein, which I'll describe in a moment. He stated that, well, India and Pakistan, regarding their recent tensions, they should sort this out themselves. They've been having these issues between themselves for 1,500 years. And I'm like, Donald Fredovich, what are you talking about, President Trump? 1,500 years, Pakistan hasn't existed for that long. In 500 AD, I'm not even sure what was happening in the Indus Valley in the Punjab, but it certainly wasn't a Muslim Christian. I mean, Islam did not exist. In any case, Donald Trump, surely he probably has some of that hollow earth, some sort of Agartha, Atlantoid, most likely some child law, which we aren't even aware of in terms of what had been happening in these ancient Indian lands all those years ago before even Islam came around. So very interesting. But again, on a more somber note, the Pakistan-India issue in Kashmir is escalating. It's very unfortunate, but there has been a major terrorist attack, which frankly overshadows even that of the Ukrainians committed in Moscow this week. Essentially, what we saw was the murder of 28 Hindu Indians, most of which were pilgrims and tourists. These are Indian tourists going to the Kashmir region, which is located between Tibet, India, and Pakistan in this triangle corner, a very beautiful mountainous region, which a lot of tourists actually go to. And Kashmir, even the people living in Kashmir they're very, shall we say, different looking. Some of them are very light skinned. They look very unique. In fact, there were a lot of crimes committed over Kashmiri women, a lot of assaults, things like this in the past decades. This has been a big sort of point of discourse. Kashmir is a religiously diverse region, and politically as well. It's divided between three countries, Pakistan, India, and China. China, again, controlling Kashmir from the Tibet side, were the least populated areas of Kashmir. So China actually doesn't really control that many people. That many of its citizens are Kashmiri, technically. But the Kashmir people, again, they were Hindus before the conquest of the Mughals and the Islamic invasion took place in the, closing in on the second millennium. But what's really important is that now, of course, with last few hundred years, Kashmir has been predominantly Muslim. And this has created, big tensions because as a large portion of Kashmir was handed over to India by the British lawyer and essentially pseudo-diplomat Kirill Radcliffe. And this is not Daniel Radcliffe who played Harry Potter, but this is Kirill Radcliffe, a man who never traveled further east than Paris in his life. His entire life he spent essentially in Western Europe. He's the most Western European lawyer. He created this Pakistan-India border and essentially cut the two countries in half when the British Empire was dissolving itself post-World War II. And again, has moved most of these Middle Eastern borders, and in particular countries like Syria, of course, the formation of Israel, a lot of them were cut down ethnic and tribal lines. So the Pakistani-Indian conflicts always keep arising, and Kashmir is the best example, the most sensitive example of this, located in the northwestern part of India and Pakistan, where they meet Tibet and the Himalayan mountains, a very sensitive area. And so what happened was these terrorists operating, these Islamic terrorists, essentially these, I guess they call themselves freedom fighters, the army of the righteous, Lashkar-e-Taiba. They're essentially Kashmiri independence fighters, similar, I guess, to the Kurdish terrorists who commit terrorist acts against the Turks. They ended up killing 28 Indian Hindus. And the witnesses described what could only be seen. I mean, it's quite obscene, actually. They asked these Hindu Indians to take off their pants, the males, and they checked if they were circumcised. And if they weren't circumcised, that would confirm their Hindu religion, and they just shot them dead on the spot. So 28 people were killed. Of course, the majority Hindu Indians rose up in revolt, both in Kashmir and at home in New Delhi, the capital of India. Narendra Modi, the Prime Minister of India, already said that India will retaliate according to this action, and already there's big moves. The Indian government is trying to find out where exactly these terrorists have been hiding. There's a few homes that are being demolished in the Kashmir region. The Indian police force is looking into these matters. And the home demolition, by the way, is not dissimilar to what's happening in Gaza, in Kashmir. The homes of these Muslims that are being destroyed. Essentially, I think what the Indians are trying to do is they're trying to find some of these terrorist caches and arms depots. Again, the gun laws in Pakistan and India are very strict. But of course, we know that North Pakistan, for example, is full of all kinds of terroristic organizations. No one really follows gun laws in these places anyway, but they're trying to find any of these terrorist cell depots in the Kashmir region because, again, they don't want a repetition of what just took place of 28 dead Hindus. And the Indian people are protesting. They want blood. They want some sort of retaliation. So the Indian government, how they've essentially responded is they've cut off a large portion of the water supply from the Indus River, which flows down the Himalayan mountains through India into Pakistan, providing water to a lot of these Pakistani agricultural farmlands, which Pakistan is quite a poor country. Technically, it's a second world country, but very teetering on the border of being a third world country. And they really do depend on this water source, especially now. Apparently, there's been huge heat waves all over Pakistan and India in this exact region, and the water supply being cut off by India in a response. Essentially, they're claiming that this water supply cutoff is temporary, that they're trying to force the Pakistani government into essentially taking their Islamist issue more seriously and to curtail Islamic terrorism, which I can't really blame them, although cutting off a water supply technically goes against international law. It could be classified as a war crime. And a lot of Pakistanis and Kashmiri Indians, especially those of the Muslim faith, are actually protesting. They're calling the Indian action or the water cutoff a war crime. But the other, of course, really scary thing is that India actually forced its aircraft carrier, the INS Vikrant, to actually take to the waters with its support groups just outside of Pakistan. Again, Pakistan does not have any aircraft carriers, but the Indian Navy is out in full force, essentially patrolling along the coastline of Pakistan in a very powerful, tenacious move, showing off its full force, essentially showing Pakistan that, look, you're much smaller than us. India has close to 1.5 billion people, the largest country by population, right? India itself has 200 million Muslims, whilst Pakistan in population size is almost 100% Muslim, 255 million Muslims. So if India ever annexes or joins to Pakistan, most likely it will be able to administer Pakistan effectively, even with a large Muslim population, because it has the experience of doing so now. So India is really showing that, look, Pakistan, you're essentially a former British aberration. You're essentially a Belarus/Ukraine creation. And if you don't keep your Islamist terrorists in check, especially in the Kashmir region, and you allow for innocent Hindu Indians to die, we're going to be forced to essentially create a special military operation of sorts, which many countries, by the way, Conrad, have already copied this special military operation model. But the only thing is, we know Turkey has done it. Essentially, Israel has done it in southern Lebanon, south of the Litani River. Many countries are copying Vladimir Putin. And we know that Narendra Modi, he's a big fan of President Putin. He, in fact, has said many times that Putin is his favorite politician, etc. The thing is, Pakistan is a nuclear power. You can't simply force an intervention into Pakistan and claim that it's a peacekeeping operation. This could escalate to a point of a huge regional war. And again, these are very poor regions. Any disruption to food supply could cause hunger in the scales of maybe the Holodomor or some of these other famines that the Bolsheviks artificially caused in the 1920s and even during the Second World War, when there were failures of agriculture and administrative management in the USSR. This could end up being essentially a war front, which frankly I did not see coming. We always knew that the Hindu-Muslim conflict will be triggered at some point. Even we know that there are literal Indian commandos fighting in Gaza, for example, assisting or training alongside the IDF. So we know the Hindu-Israeli alliance has been very close. And even India's relation with the Gulf states is very interesting. Pakistan seemingly does not have any allies. It's not really friendly with Shia Iran because it's a Sunni majority country. the only economic real ally that Pakistan has is China. And China, fortunately enough, is not a friend of India either. So China has been, of course, supplying Pakistan with a lot of its exports and has been receiving imports from Pakistan in the textile industries, which you mentioned earlier regarding Belarus and Lukashenko. Maybe Lukashenko's Belarus will become Pakistan's greatest ally, but that's a bit of a joke. We won't be going there. In any case, we're yet to see where this Pakistan-India escalation will go, Conrad, because at the moment the aircraft carrier is in the waters. There's frankly a lot of aircraft carriers all around the Middle Eastern region. It's looking very, very tense. And the rhetoric on the ground is both sides are protesting. The Pakistanis are calling the Indians war criminals, and the Indians are out calling the Pakistani Islamic terrorists. So the borders between these two countries are highly volatile, and these are two nuclear powers. It's something which we haven't seen in a few years in the region.
No, it's a very interesting development. We have talked about the India-Pakistan conflict being a inflection point in the ongoing Third World War, but the fact that just such a random terrorist attack like this really brings it to the spotlight. It shows you how black swan events and random, kinetic activity can make sure that, can really surprise us in the course of these events, which is something that we have always, covered on the show. But the latest news from India, this is from Bellam Akta. It says, government sources have confirmed to the Indian Express that a military option is being prepared in response to the Pahalgam terrorist attack, with operational planning and force posture adjustments underway. Current planning could involve the use of standoff weaponry launched from Indian territory, with target selection still being finalized. New Delhi continues to directly attribute responsibility to Pakistan, including senior leadership figures such as the Pakistan Army Chief. Based on the available information, it is reasonable to assess that cruise and ballistic missile options are being actively considered. So again, between two nuclear states, this is very serious. Obviously, here on the show, we have a bit of a different perspective on the reality of nuclear war. I think a lot of the radiation, kind of nuclear fallout situation is a bit exaggerated, which I believe does comport with a lot of the prophecies. Metropolitan Neophytos, Elder Joseph of Vatopedi, they talk about this, how even Constantinople itself and regions in Turkey will be bombarded with nuclear weapons, but just mere weeks later, the areas will still be able to be habitable and hospitable, which I think, many say that, it'll be a miracle. But even more than that, I think the miracle will be that we were just lied to about the actual damaging effect of nuclear weapons for the purpose of mutually assured destruction, which up until this point has exclusively benefited the unipolar world order, the United States, who are, as of right now, the only people that have openly and publicly used nuclear weapons in warfare, of course, on the Japanese. But as far as the situation in Kashmir goes, people need to realize that Kashmir is likely the most heavily militarized region of the entire world. Before the Russia-Ukraine war started, which may, again, much larger front line, ironically enough, they say up to 350,000 troops on both sides stationed here. There's the Chinese element as well, so it's sort of this three-way front. Dmitry mentioned Pakistan having an ally in China, which will very much help them in the region, because not only is Kashmir disputed between India and China, we've also in the past discussed Arunachal Pradesh and Ladakh, which are other Himalayan regions that have experienced clashes between Indian and Chinese soldiers, where they use the sticks instead of hot shooting weapons, as it were. But as far as Pakistan's alliance with Iran, you mentioned, the only thing Iran and Pakistan really share in common is, I guess, they want to see Balochistan calmed down. I don't know, maybe Pakistan has a claim on Iranian Balochistan, but there are Israeli and United States-backed ISIS-K and ISIS-Balochistan terrorists that constantly cause problems for Pakistan and Iran in that region. That the Balochistan region is in Pakistan, Iran, and Afghanistan. So maybe if there'd be some collaboration from Iran there, but the region also is a cause of tension between those two states as well. So the fact that Iran wants to negotiate, I think they would probably generally side with the Pakistanis, considering that India, of course, a Hindu state, a close ally of Israel. I could see Iran wanting to make sure that, Pakistan doesn't fall more into the sphere of influence of the United States. Because look, Imran Khan, very pro-Palestine, very, this multipolar leader, he was forced out by Western forces. The fact that the new government, ostensibly an installed government in Pakistan, has still had to vociferously go against Israel and support the Palestinians proves that ultimately, Pakistan is very much one of these Islamic states that views itself as an ally of their Islamic Palestinian brothers. You mentioned it being a Sunni majority as well. There are large Shia minorities in Pakistan. You'll see during Ashura celebrations some of the largest displays of the self-flagellation in Pakistan. They flagellate themselves with knife whips, like whips of swords. and like rip open their back and there's blood everywhere. It's very disgusting to see, but much of that is going on in Pakistan. So they don't only have to deal with, Hindu persecution in a way, they also have to do with Islamic disputes, which have always been the bane of the Islamic world and the Ummah, preventing them from coming together. But as the Iranians attempt to negotiate with this, there is also this ongoing massive fire, this explosion that occurred at Bandar Abbas port, one of the biggest ports in southern Iran. They claim it was some kind of nitrate or ammonium nitrate exploding. They're even claiming that there were Chinese ships in the area. Israel has denied any involvement in this explosion. Most outlets, including even in Iran, are attributing it to some sort of form of negligence, which, again, that's a big issue for Iran, between the brain drain, the amount of people that have been forced to leave because of sanctions, and how kind of surrounded on all sides the Iranian regime is. They're experiencing a sort of dearth of talented personnel. These sort of things happen. Many people have tried to attribute that brain drain to the reason why Ibrahim Raisi's helicopter crashed, the reason why the morality police are susceptible to these scandals that outrage the international community. These sorts of things are discussed as far as Iran sort of losing, high agency people that are being forced to leave the country. But this fire is still raging. They've claimed well over 200 injuries. I think the death count is going to continue to climb. But the fire, again, breaking news right now, so by the time you're listening to this, it may have already gone a different direction, but be sure to follow us at the World War Now Telegram, World War Now Telly, to keep up with all of this news. But I think we've pretty much covered the Iranian, Pakistani, Indian issue. I think the next obvious issue with China, who is the other sort of player in that region, they are not just getting involved in Kashmir or in the Himalayas. Big news occurred recently. This is from Rerum Novarum. Chinese forces capture Sand Key, located in the northwest of the Tizard Bank, South China Sea. The Chinese military landed on the key, raising its flag, geolocated. The key, which is mostly uninhabited, has Vietnamese military installations as well as a fishing station, and it is very close to the Philippines. We know about the Thomas Shoal incident, where Filipino and Chinese ships continue to ram each other, shoot each other with water cannons, provoke each other, as China continues to expand its military footprint in the South China Sea. Again, this all comes, I think, in conjunction with everything going on in Iran. China continues to help Iran economically by being their largest crude oil customer. I believe they also provide them with other materials that do, in the Iranian production network, get turned into their missiles. So China is in many ways indirectly arming Iran, which is something that's going to continue to provoke the ire of the West. But the reason why China would be so eager to push its military footprint in the South China Sea is because we've talked about how, let's say this war with Iran occurs, let's say Israel strikes the nuclear capabilities, the U.S. is dragged into a hot conflict there, ground troops are sent. China could very easily see that as a great opportunity to intervene militarily in Taiwan and save as many lives as possible, because if the U.S. sees that China deploys a full military force to Taiwan with its new massive amphibious landing vehicles that can get ships and trucks to completely skip the beachhead and land directly onto Taiwanese highways, the U.S. might be forced to wash its hands of the matter and just accept that the one China policy is going to be actualized for real this time, which, if China does that, I'd have to give them a lot of respect, because that would be one of the most beneficial things they could do to their Iranian allies. They did not do that, for example, at the beginning of the Russia-Ukraine war, most likely because they didn't think the time was right. So if this occurs, it would prove that the China-Iran relationship is likely even closer than the Russia-Chinese relationship, or even the Russia-Iran relationship. So very fascinating developments in China. Xi Jinping, of course, has been fighting the trade war with the United States. Of course, a lot of them that has been backed off. Trump seems to be, at best, it seems, instead of having an overhaul of trade policy, Trump seems to be wanting to move manufacturing from China to India, which from an America First perspective means absolutely nothing. If anything, it might make it worse. I trust Chinese factory workers more than Indian factory workers. But this is from The Diplomat, an Asia Pacific news outlet. It says, deep uncertainty remains, as Trump has said the pause on reciprocal tariffs would only last for 90 days, and relief beyond that was contingent on each government negotiating a trade deal with the United States. Under the tariffs outlined on April 2nd, Southeast Asian countries were among the most impacted, with Vietnam getting a 46% tariff, Cambodia getting a 49% tariff, and Malaysia a 24% tariff. It is no coincidence that these were the three countries that Xi Jinping visited during his recent trip abroad during 2025. So in the past few days, Xi has been hopping around Asia, shoring up his alliances with his peripheral states that are also being targeted by the United States trade war. This is obviously not just for economic reasons, but for military reasons, using the fact that the US has become aggressive with its economy, harming these other countries that are production powerhouses. Xi is using this as an opportunity to say, see, look, isn't it better to just be aligned with China? You can trust us. We are, more similar to you. We are both Orientals. These sorts of things are probably what they're talking about. This article goes on to say these economies are mostly dependent on exports to the US. In 2024, Vietnam's exports to the US total $136 billion, representing 34% of its total exports. While they primarily export their goods to the United States, these countries are also close economic partners of China, and Xi sought to capitalize on their mistreatment by the Trump administration. The Chinese leader's message was simple. While the U.S. turns towards isolationism and imposes trade barriers, China offers partnership and open markets. Xi drove home his point by putting forth the Asian family concept, which, I'll be honest, I hadn't even read that section of the article before I made my comments earlier, so I am on the pulse here. But as far as the Taiwan situation goes, no new analysis per se. China continues to buzz them with ships and planes. We hear news pretty much every week about new undersea cables, whether it be from Formosa itself or the Kinmen Islands and these other things closer to the Chinese mainland, constantly being cut, much like the cables in the Baltic Sea between the Baltic states and the Scandinavian states have been cut, often even by Chinese ships, which are sort of helping their helping their Russian friends up there. But if you have any thoughts on China, the situation in the South China Sea, Dimitri, or any final thoughts on Iran and the subcontinent as well, I'd love to hear them before we move on to Africa.
Yeah, I think some of the most fascinating news, Conrad, is probably from Africa because, look, we're literally seeing Donald J. Trump utilize the same tactics. In some ways, he's repeating himself. Just as he's using Witkoff in Iran, he's also using him in Russia. And just as he applied the mineral treaty to Ukraine, which hasn't been signed yet, who has signed the mineral treaty. And it's very similar, in fact, well, not as oppressive, I suppose, but very similar to the Ukrainian one, but he's applied it to the Democratic Republic of Congo. And in fact, the Congolese have signed the treaty, the Congolese government. And why did Trump intervene? It's because the Republic of Congo, as well as Rwanda, have officially signed a U.S. brokered agreement, essentially. And the peace deal will be secured by the 2nd of May. And so the conflict between the DRC and Rwanda will officially end. What's curious, however, is not just the mineral deal itself, which will guarantee the U.S. buys up large quantities of lithium, cobalt, titanium from the DRC, again, one of the most mineral rich, and in some ways, I think almost Elon Musk himself probably whispered in Trump's ear, right? Not just as a Doge advisor, but also as an effective businessman who uses a lot of these minerals. And he's like, look, Trump, we really need to guarantee that these minerals reach America, right, safely and securely. And so the DRC, again, not the richest country with a huge population that needs to be secured by, a continuous flow of foreign currency. And we know the country has a lot of tribes, ethnicities, almost, I think more than Russia does, actually, probably one of the most diverse nation states on earth. So, of course, Qatar has secured a deal between M23 officially and the Democratic Republic of Congo, not between Rwanda and the DRC. So it's almost like side by side, there are these two treaties, whether or not out of Goma and Bukavu, whether or not M23 will leave these two particular cities, it's not been announced yet. But it almost appears, Conrad, as if Doha and Qatar have turned into this Brussels of the Middle East and Africa in some ways. Like it is the new Belgium of international relations. It's that official base of diplomacy where everyone goes for the Russo-Ukrainian conflict, for the Iran-Israel-Hamas discussions. Very bizarre. And of course, Qatar, as we know, officially funded the Syrian jihadi Takfiri revolution, which took place and ousted Assad. So it's not like Qatar is like this peace-loving nation in and of itself. We know there's a lot of manipulation that they're involved in. And it's very similar to the United Arab Emirates, which is, again, promoting Dubai is promoting the conflict in Sudan, of course, supporting the anti-government rebels there. So it's very curious how both of these small, seemingly demilitarized nations who are like in a Singapore type state, they have a lot of money, but not a lot of firepower, are supporting all these various rebellious movements, which can be paid off. They're supporting all this instability in various regions and sometimes acting as these middle persons between deals. It's very reminiscent of like the Renaissance period when you had Venice and Genoa, of course, operating in the Mediterranean and the broader European theater of war, again, between like the Turks, Constantinople, and some of the other Crusader states. But the only difference is Genoa and Venice actually had powerful navies, whereas the UAE and Qatar, really, their militaries are, subpar compared to their neighbors. So it's a very curious situation happening here. So it does seem like that conflict in Central Africa has reached perhaps its temporary end. Maybe, depending what happens in Goma and Bukavu, will the M23 leave? There are reports of over 2,000 casualties in this conflict. There's a lot of, as we said, indecencies, assaults against children, which most likely will be investigated soon. Who knows, right? These conflicts in Africa, they tend to result in a large waves of abuse, and who knows, child traffickers around the world, how many children? Remember, in Syria, generally across the Syrian civil war, apparently between 50 and 80,000 Syrian children simply went missing across refugee camps, across all these Syrian regions captured by ISIS, etc. And it's probably the same in all these African conflicts. You have children going missing, again, whether or not they're being trafficked somewhere or taken, it's a big consideration. But there are reports of child abuse certainly taking place there in the DRC. And so Donald J. Trump, again, securing peace, again, is coming out as this peacekeeper, even for the African nations, not just the Middle Easterners or the Eastern Europeans. And I think this probably is the first successful peace discussion that Trump has had during his presidency in the first 100 days, which, look, we have to hand it to him. This has been a success. We were worried that perhaps the Central African conflict would escalate into something completely unhinged, like a new Tutsi and Hutu conflict that would lead to millions of deaths, which it definitely could have, because it's been a good generation since the last massive genocide and massacre that has taken place here. There's a lot of people who grew up on these horror stories, a lot of PTSD, trauma, and again, this need for vengeance that constantly provokes these people to potentially rise up again and rectify some of the injustice that was committed to them in the past. So very concerning in general, but I think Trump has finally secured an actual peace treaty that will last. So it's really curious. But the most surprising thing is that Qatar was involved in the first place between M23 and the DRC official government, which tells me that the Gulf states very much are trying to play this quasi-Jewish type role in international relations. They're really trying to almost match the Jewish international relations approach, to both African and Middle Eastern countries. They're like, look, we don't necessarily have the largest armies, but we can have the most presence in a lot of these developing nations in order to try and move them towards our sphere of influence in some capacity. So it's interesting where that will go.
No, this Africa conflict has been fascinating, especially with this being the resolution. It almost puts even more credence on the idea that the entire incursion by M23, the response by the Congolese, was sort of, I don't want to say orchestrated, but very much allowed to happen, encouraged to continue, sort of encouraged so that atrocity propaganda could be perpetuated. Not that these atrocities didn't occur, but, big headlines, kids being killed, women being raped, these sorts of things, to now what happens? Huge resource deals the United States signs with both sides. So, the United States winning big. Dan Gertler, the main mining Israeli Jewish magnate in the Congo, I'm sure he is very happy his areas will be very much protected. So this is, I wouldn't say surprising, but it very much lends credence to the fact that this was not just a naturally occurring, ethnic dispute that finally boiled over. This was a calculated effort to secure resources for the Western Bloc in the ongoing Third World War. But you mentioned Qatar and the United Arab Emirates. This is just a brief note. Of course, the Rapid Support Forces have been radically pushed out of Khartoum, a lot of Sudan. They've set up a new administrative capital in a different city. But not only have they been called out and pushed back, now that these international groups are looking in, there was apparently a condemnation of the head of the Sudanese armed forces. I'm forgetting his name. Apparently he is now facing international backlash, international scrutiny for potential war crimes and whatnot. And the UAE, despite always pretending that they don't support the Rapid Support Forces, the moment that this happened, they came out and were like, we are happy to see that the head of Sudan and their armed forces is being condemned. He's an evil warlord, all these sorts of things. So you're correct, Dimitri. These Gulf states, obviously they're very much working against the Houthis in Yemen, and they have hopped across the Red Sea into Sudan and these other African countries with large Muslim populations in an attempt to expand their sphere of influence, which ultimately has to do with expanding the sphere of influence of Israel. It would seem that the Rapid Support Forces are probably who Israel would like to be in power as well, despite the fact that a lot of these countries like Russia have thrown their hat in with the SAF, which I don't know how soon Russia will be getting that Red Sea base from the Syrian armed forces, but perhaps if the RSF continue to lose, that will happen a lot sooner. There have been some news in Ethiopia about, some new conflicts in the Tigray region with new leadership there. We're going to be keeping an eye on that, of course, as well as Libya, as it seems that the Turks are finally willing to support the Haftar government, which, if they're willing to do that entirely, that could lead to the complete dissolution of the Tripoli-based government, and we could see Libya largely unified under one government again. And it's been, over 14 years since that occurred at this point, so that would be quite a big development on the continent. But unless you have anything else to say about that, Dimitri, we do have to get into some church news. There's a decent amount this week, especially considering we didn't do a show for Holy Week. We didn't give you a show about Pascha, which, you don't need us to tell you about Pascha. Everything is summed up in the liturgy and the Paschal homily of St. John Chrysostom. But big story here, this is on Ortho Christian. Authorities prevent Moldovan bishop from going to Jerusalem for the Holy Fire. So, of course, I'm sure everyone kept up with the Holy Fire, which descended, as it always does, on Holy Saturday. Many priests, Catholic, Oriental Orthodox, and of course, Orthodox Christians themselves were mistreated and kicked out by the Israeli authorities. We saw many scuffles and brawls. Israeli officials were impolitely standing atop of, stones and rocks that are considered holy where Jesus was. And when they were confronted by Armenians or Greeks, they were, those people were harshly escorted out. So the soft persecution against the Christians in the Holy Land continues. But from Chisinau, this says, Moldovan authorities blocked a hierarch of the Moldovan Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate from flying to Jerusalem to retrieve the Holy Fire. I still don't understand why I wasn't released to Israel, said His Eminence Archbishop Marcel of Balti and Falesti. And for those that don't know, Archbishop Marcel, he is one of our favorite bishops here on the show. He was a strong advocate against the vaccine. He's been a strong supporter of the canonical church in Ukraine, as well as just, true, good, liturgical, conservative, traditional orthodoxy. He is, I would say even my favorite bishop in all of Moldova. So it's very unfortunate to see this, but it is no surprise. Romania, Moldova, these places are, cowering under the boot of this sort of Western neoliberal oppression. Moldova, Maya Sandu, they have been rigging the election there for a long time. We know how most Moldovans in Russia were effectively barred from voting because there were like 2 voting places in all of Russia. So that was how Maya Sandu and her party, the neoliberals in Moldova, are able to stay in power. Of course, it's not too dissimilar from Calin Georgescu's, arrest and barring from running for office in Romania. There's very much a authoritarian democracy is very much in vogue for all of these peripheral European Union states. But this article says this hierarch was pulled aside for an inspection at the Chisinau airport on Holy Thursday and was held without his passport until after his flight had already departed. He was never given any explanation for why he wasn't permitted to travel. Meanwhile, the delegation from the Romanian Orthodox Church's metropolis of Bessarabia was permitted to fly to Israel to witness and bring back the Holy Fire. For 3 decades, there have been 2 overlapping jurisdictions in Moldova, the Moscow Patriarchate's metropolis of Chisinau and all Moldova, and the Romanian Orthodox Church's metropolis of Bessarabia, which have essentially tolerated each other since the latter was reestablished in 1991 by a bishop formerly of the Russian Church's structure. However, relations have severely deteriorated since the start of the war in Ukraine. A number of clerics and parishes have moved from the Moscow side to the Romanian side, but as these transitions were made without a canonical release, a number of the clerics have been defrocked. However, the metropolis of Bessarabia has declared these canonical sanctions null and void, and on February 29th, the Holy Synod of the entire Romanian Orthodox Church took the same position. So unfortunately, Archbishop Marcel has effectively become the victim of the Moldovan and Romanian state stepping in against the Russian Orthodox Church, which I pray that this doesn't turn into another Ukraine or Estonia situation where a parallel body is now claiming all of a certain territory that was historically Russian ecclesial territory as their own. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on this situation, Dimitri, the Moldovan ecclesiological situation, as well as any other church news you want to bring to light here.
Yeah, I think Moldova is a very complicated country. Naturally, initially, of course, it had huge independence. Saint Stephen the Great, who was recently canonized. Moldova was a big Orthodox Christian monarchist country, like one of the 3 Romanian key states, Wallachia, Transylvania, Moldova. It was essentially very independent, fighting against the Turks, but just like many of these other Balkan Orthodox Christian nations and other nations in Central Eastern Europe, it did fall to the Ottoman Turks. And the Moldovan Orthodox Church was, fortunately enough, established by the liberating armies of Empress Catherine the Great under her second husband, Gregory Potemkin. Actually, he helped administer, and he actually lived in Moldova for a very long time in Bessarabia. He helped fundraise. He helped set up the administration. So in some ways, despite the fact that Gregory Potemkin, the Russian general and a very influential figure, he's a real giga chad, like 2 meters tall. He was a big personality. He was the sponsor of both Alexander Suvorov as well as Saint Ushakov. St. Fyodor Ushakov, of course, is a very interesting figure in historically being the second husband of the Russian Empress. But he's helped set up the Moldovan Orthodox Church. And since the 1700s, Moldova was very closely linked to Russia because Russia was always associated with granting Moldova this new spiritual and, again, cultural independence away from the Turks. And this is why I think Moldovans today, being hyper-European and hyper-liberalized, at least the government and the elites are, they're trying to escape this magnetic pull that Russia has towards Moldova. And naturally, Transnistria, Pridnestrovia is that key sliver of land that still holds on to that Russian imperial heritage, which I think, obviously Alexander Suvorov, soon to be canonized, Fyodor Ushakov, like these are great historical figures, which are all in some capacity related to that Moldovan independence. It's a really incredible land, incredible country. And I think hopefully in the future, it does choose the right side. It doesn't turn into this new mini Ukraine. I think that's a hope for all Romanians. And I think Moldova, as a part of Romania historically, also needs to follow that particular path of orthodoxy as opposed to NATOization and NATOism. And just want to mention, this may be somewhat related to church news, but there has been a very brave Orthodox Christian who has recently been killed in the Kurskaya Oblast. His name was Roman Makushin. He was a Russian Orthodox Cossack from Kazakhstan, and he recently has been killed in the Kursk Oblast, which is obviously the fighting has been intense. A lot of Russian soldiers have been killed, but what makes Roman Makushin so special? In fact, in 2022, around the time we started this podcast, Roman, he was just a regular person living in Kazakhstan. At the time, he traveled to Russia to fight in the special military operation to defend Russia from these mercenary NATO incursions and NATO essentially. And he trained in a Wagner special camp for 3 weeks, 21 days only, 0 military experience. He became an incredibly skilled fighter. He fought alongside Wagner in Bakhmut, in Avdiivka, in Solidar, I believe. And eventually his path of the warrior, of course, this Orthodox Christian Cossack, ended in Kursk. But what's interesting is he was a direct descendant of the great Orthodox Christian Cossack Ataman hero Alexander Dutov, who we're going to cover at the end of Ritual Regicide in part 3, which will be released this year. Alexander Dutov was a great Orthodox Christian Cossack, one of the leaders of the White Army. And what's interesting about him is obviously he saved a lot of Orthodox Christian icons. The Kazan Theotokos, miracle working icon, of course, was saved by him. One of the copies of it, he again retreated with the White Army to China. He helped a lot of Orthodox Christian refugees escape Bolshevik terrorism. And in the end, Dutov himself was living in the town of Shuiding, which is located in essentially the Uyghur Autonomous Region. So near Kazakhstan, where China meets Kazakhstan in that particular Muslim-heavy region in the 1920s. And of course, Ataman Dutov already retired at this point, living there with his family on a farm. And now that the Russian Civil War was over, you think peace was abound. But however, the Talmudic Bolshevik elites had different plans. They sent a group of Bolshevik Cheka assassins to Dutov's farm in the Uyghur region of China, and they broke into his house, murdered him, beheaded him, and took his head back to Moscow, to the Kremlin. And Alexander Dutov, of course, an Orthodox Christian, we don't know even where his head is to this day. Most likely, maybe in some sort of secret KGB, FSB archive somewhere, where alongside the heads of all these other people that the Bolsheviks beheaded, including Tsar Nicholas II, a big sort of discourse. But the fact that his descendant joined the Russian army and turned out to be this amazing warrior, there's a lot of great photographs of him. Russian media has been mourning his passing. It just shows you that really, the blood of these White Army warriors has really joined up with their now liberated, Russians who lived under the communist yoke, and they're fighting a common battle. This is literally a descendant of the White Army heroes, and it's really, we, of course, Roman, God rest his soul and memory eternal. So a lot of these big heroical stories coming out from the SMO, which is really interesting. But we'll be covering Ataman Dutov some more in Ritual Regicide Part 3, so definitely stay tuned. And in relation to further church news in Ukraine, it has been quite quiet over this Easter period, most likely because all of Ukraine, including the schismatics, was celebrating Easter. And so naturally, they were a bit maybe too busy capturing Orthodox Christian churches and occupying them. But we have had some very extensive fake news being spread, both by Ben Shapiro and Zelensky in their sort of sub 1 hour interview, which was released recently, in which Zelensky lied to Ben Shapiro's face. And Shapiro didn't even, of course, Shapiro being an Orthodox Talmudic Jew, didn't oppose Zelensky's false news about the fact that Orthodoxy was not being persecuted. He openly essentially stated that the church was not being persecuted in Ukraine, which was a complete lie. And similar news is being spread by Trump's spiritual advisor. You know, Trump being a Protestant, he has a spiritual advisor, Pastor Mark Burns, an African-American, who at the end of March, he actually visited Ukraine because not to see any sort of Christian leaders, but to meet Rabbi Moshe Azman, the chief rabbi of Ukraine. And the chief rabbi of Ukraine told Trump's spiritual advisor, Mark Burns, that guess what? There aren't any Christians being persecuted in Ukraine. So I have a few questions. Mark Burns, why are we listening to rabbis about what's happening in Ukraine, spiritually speaking? You should speak to some of the bishops like Metropolitan Theodosius of Cherkasy or even Metropolitan Yevlogy of Sumy, who's a lot more neutral in the entire Ukrainian-Russian war because, but in any case, there's a lot of fake news being spread that there is actually no persecution taking place. In some ways, I am grateful that Robert Amsterdam, people like Tucker Carlson, and even to some extent J.D. Vance are spreading the reality of the matter that, look, there is actually a persecution taking place in Ukraine. It needs to be addressed. It needs to be almost discussed at these Witkoff peace talks. And some more positive news from Ukraine, right? This is not essentially related to persecution, but in some capacity, the Ukrainians on the 23rd of April, they've released a list. The SBU, actually, the Ukrainian CIA, has released a list of Russian bishops who have essentially offended against the Ukrainian state. The list has 14 archbishops and bishops and metropolitans on it. A lot of these bishops actually are not even from lands or dioceses adjacent to Ukraine in any way. So essentially, the Ukrainians have said that they've found these bishops guilty of crimes against Ukraine, and they're all charged in absentia because they're not going to attend any of these Ukrainian hearings. And these bishops include a very strange list. There's former Bishop Leonid Gorbachev, the Exarch of Moscow in Africa. If you recall, now the new Exarch of Russia in Africa is, of course, Metropolitan Constantine. But Leonid was the first Exarch of the Russian Orthodox Church in Africa, which was established only a few years ago. He's on the list. You have Bishop Tarasi of Severomorsk, which is located on the Arctic Circle. It's like, what exactly is going on? You have Bishop Nikolu of Severobaikalisk, which is located in Siberia, which had nothing to do with Ukraine at all. You have, of course, Bishop Ambrose, Metropolitan of Tver. All these various bishops that the Ukraine has now marked as enemies of the Ukrainian state, almost putting them on a kill list. And this taking place only 2 days before the assassination of the general, it's very unnerving, I think. And we should keep all these bishops who we've listed on our World War Now channel in our prayers, frankly, and pray that this conflict ends with probably a powerful Russian victory. And in fact, we aren't the only ones who are, of course, hoping for this. There was a recent visit of Patriarch Porphyrius, the Patriarch of Belgrade and all of Serbia, to Moscow. He met with Patriarch Kirill, and they've had amazing, not just joint services and prayers and discussions, but just the friendship between them. And Porphyrius even joked, Conrad, I'm sure you've seen the clip. He said that, we Orthodox Christians, we have a secret weapon in the world, that is Vladimir Putin, which I found really cool. So he essentially said Vladimir Putin is promoting Orthodox Christian values in the world, and that's a huge asset to the church, which I think is more or less true. Despite all of Putin's shortcomings, he has in fact pushed a more or less Orthodox Christian ethic and morality in international world affairs, including, of course, protecting the Syrian Orthodox Christians of the Antiochian Orthodox Church from ISIS for close to a decade. So there's a lot of good things that Vladimir Putin has done, despite all of the other shortcomings which we mention every now and then. Then also, of course, Patriarch Kirill told Patriarch Porphyrius in this really jointly brotherly meeting that the Serbian Orthodox Christians and Russians have never had any conflicts or disputes whatsoever. They've remained friends for centuries, and it's a good example of how two autonomous, autocephalous jurisdictions can remain in friendly relations for such a prolonged period of time and always come to an understanding. And in some ways, even like going off of the Q&A that we had, Conrad, discussing Metropolitan Yevlogius and his split from Rokor, guess who was the middleman in those discussions to bring peace between Rokor and Metropolitan Eulogius of Paris? It was, of course, the Patriarch of Serbia. So the Patriarchate of Serbia has always come out in this really brotherly attitude towards the Russians, and it's a really good historical example. And a really final, very interesting piece of news. It's not very, I suppose, church-related, but it is ecumenism-related, which I think will be very interesting. In the Dagestani city of Derbent, Rabbi Ber Lazar, as well as he's the chief rabbi of Russia, as well as some top Muslim officials, have met up and they've opened up the construction site, which is now building a new ecumenist center called the Caucasus Jerusalem, or the Jerusalem of the Caucasus. A very, shall we say, devious name, considering we know that the Khazarian sort of New Heavenly Jerusalem project, which the Ukrainian Jews have been speaking about for decades now, is essentially something that may have even led to this conflict that we're in right now. But this Caucasus Jerusalem Center, Conrad, it will essentially be this big Abrahamic center, and Abrahamic center with a Muslim prayer house, a synagogue, and apparently a church. It's not stated whether or not this church will be an Orthodox Christian church, but if it will be, hopefully it isn't, but it needs to be denounced and renounced very quickly. There's no reason why a synagogue and a church should be occupying the same vicinity and building. This is egregious. The fact that Ber Lazar, the head of the Chabad, the supporter of the IDF, the supporter of Netanyahu, this really devious, dark character who has been essentially polluting Russian politics for more than 3 decades now, the fact that he's involved in ecumenism and promoting essentially spiritual degeneracy in Russia raises a lot of red flags as to why he's even allowed to do these things. But fortunately enough, the clip where the opening and sort of the cutting of the ribbon on the construction zone of the new Caucasus Jerusalem took place, there were no Orthodox priests present. There was some imams and some rabbis, including Ber Lazar himself, but I didn't see any Orthodox priests, monks, or deacons, or bishops for that fact. So hopefully Orthodox Christians stay away from collaborating in any ecumenism. I mean, we spoke about ecumenism with Catholics, of course, in our 8th-hour episode this week, but God forbid ecumenism with Talmudic Jews. Let's just keep that as far away from the Orthodox Church as possible. So some very interesting news, as always, coming out of Russia and Ukraine. But the good news is that, look, not much persecution this week. The only sort of bishop that has been harassed in this fortnight, this bi-weekly period, was Metropolitan Anthony, who is one of the most outspoken pro-Ukrainian, and I say pro-Ukrainian, he's pro-Metropolitan Onufri, he's pro-Ukrainian Orthodox Church. He saved a lot of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church officials from going into schism into the OCU. He's openly spoken out, in fact, for Ukrainian Orthodox solidarity, for essentially no one going into schism, for remaining united with Moscow as well. His house has been searched by the Ukrainian SBU CIA. They simply came in with a warrant and began searching his house, harassing him. So it's very similar to the Bolshevik times. And this happened just before Easter. So very interesting. And the last sort of bit of news is Epiphany Domenko. Let's discuss the clown himself. Sergei, the alleged Metropolitan of Kiev, has made 2 particular massive fumbles, I would say. One of them was that he came out on a big interview inside of one of the church halls of the Kiev Pecherska Lavra, I believe, based on the icons in the background, and he gave an interview to a Ukrainian journalist. In this interview, Conrad, he proclaimed that the schism in Ukraine is being dealt with slowly, with nuance, peacefully, and with love. So he's talking about, again, the occupation, the raiding of all these churches, the taking of monasteries, the attack on Orthodox Christian laypersons, clergymen, etc. He's saying that it's going according to plan of peace and love, which this is the false love which our church fathers have described, this false love with, a love that's not really based in the scriptures or church tradition. And the other thing that Sergei Domenko has committed recently was, again, it shows, right? It shows where this entire ecumenical patriarchate OCU project is going. He conducted a memorial service, a panichida, for the soul of Pope Francis, which is, look, you can have private prayers for non-Orthodox Christians. That's always possible. But the Orthodox Church cannot serve any memorial services or panichidas or any of these funerary services for non-Orthodox Christians. The prayers do not make any sense. The prayers being read out at the services are essentially for members of the church that have been baptized, chrismated. It's for members of the community in and of itself. Pope Francis was never a member of the Orthodox Church. Why is this false Metropolitan of Kiev serving a memorial service for Pope Francis? It's just ridiculous. But it does show the motivations of these people and the fact that eventually they will be moving towards a new unia, potentially with Patriarch Bartholomew, whoever follows, God forbid, Archbishop Elpidophorus at the helm. And, these people are very much inclined to not just culturally westernize, but also ecclesiastically move towards a union with Rome. I think that's most likely the end goal project that's being promoted here. So it's not just autocephaly away from Russia, it's essentially a joining with the greater beast, which is that Latinizing church in the West, which has caused the downfall of so many Orthodox Christians and communities throughout the last few centuries. So very funny but shocking news from Sergei Domenko, as per usual.
Domenko is, as usual, making a clown of himself, but I do have a bit of a white pill on the persecution front. This is from Ortho-Christian Estonia. President rejects law banning Moscow Patriarchate, says it's unconstitutional in current form. Estonian President Alar Karis declined yesterday to promulgate amendments to the Churches and Congregations Act that would effectively ban the Estonian Orthodox Christian Church and Holy Dormition Puhtitsa Monastery, saying they're unconstitutional. The head of state sent the relevant act back to the Riigikogu, which I guess is the parliament of Estonia, saying it disproportionately restricts the freedom of association and religion. They're violating several articles of the Constitution. So this is a good thing to see. The president believes that the Moscow Patriarchate undermines the sovereignty and democracy of states, but that the act as currently worded could do more harm than good. The amendments were adopted in their third reading by the Riigikogu earlier this month, prompting appeals by the church and monastery to the president and the U.S. Commission of International Religious Freedom. So we're all very happy to see that, and I think that is a fairly good piece of news to end the show on. It's been a long one today. I want to thank everybody for tuning in. Subscribe, worldwarnow.co. That is where you can find all of our stuff. You can find our latest Ether Hour episode with Dave Riley, where we discuss the papacy, the death of Pope Francis, everything going on there, the Papal Conclave of 2025. You can also get behind the paywall and support the show. You can also follow us on Twitter at worldwarnow_. You can follow me at GnomeRad. You can follow Dimitri at WWN Host. Be sure to subscribe to us on Telegram at WorldWarNowTelly. Of course, we are on YouTube at World War Now. I will be streaming every Tuesday evening, 7:45 p.m. CST on the World War Live show, which I hope everybody tunes into. It's been going really well. We've been having a great time. But yeah, to get behind that paywall, worldwarnow.co, worldwarnow.substack.com. That is how you get access to all of the Ether Hours, our Q&A threads, everything else going on there. So with all those plugs, Dimitri, I will leave you with the last word.
Thank you all for listening to the very end. Appreciate the likes, the support, the shares. The algorithm is a savage beast that we just have to kind of rein in, on YouTube, Substack, etc. So thank you for all the support and all the engagement. And Christ is risen, Christos Voskresie. Have a great end of the Bright Week. Again, we're at the end of that period, but there's less than 40 days, but a long period of Easter ahead of us. So definitely stay in that joyous time, and I really appreciate it. We've gone through Great Lent, and we're finally at the end of it. Conrad, thank you for this wonderful episode. Christ is risen.
Truly, he is risen. Hope to see you guys on the next one.